I always enjoyed camping. There was something calming about the wilderness, the quiet of the woods, and the simplicity of life when surrounded by nature. I wasn't new to it, having spent many weekends hiking, setting up tents, and cooking over open flames. But that one trip, it didn't go the way I expected. It all started a few weeks before the planned trip. I had been talking with a few friends, trying to figure out the best spot for a weekend away. One of them, Dan, a fellow outdoor enthusiast, suggested a place he had discovered a few years back, deep in the forest, near a remote lake. The kind of place most people didn't know about, let alone go to. I was excited. The idea of a secluded spot, far from the noise and the usual crowds, felt perfect. The drive there wasn't long, only about 3 hours, and we were able to get to the trailhead by mid-afternoon. We loaded our gear, grabbed our packs, and began the hike into the woods. The path was a little overgrown, with branches and shrubs brushing against our legs, but the air was fresh, and the sound of birds and rustling leaves made everything feel peaceful. We kept a steady pace, chatting and laughing as we walked. The trail wasn't marked well, but Dan seemed to know the way. I trusted him. After a while, the trail started to narrow, and the trees grew thicker, their canopies blocking out most of the sun. The temperature dropped slightly, and the forest around us grew denser, quieter. It wasn't until we hit a clearing that I realized something was off. Dan stopped, looking around. "It should be right over here," he said, but his voice sounded different. There was a hesitance, a lack of certainty. He checked his map. "Yeah, this is the spot, just through here." We continued forward, but the deeper we went, the more uneasy I began to feel. The quiet seemed too still. It wasn't like the usual serenity of the woods. There was no wind, no animal noises. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. We eventually arrived at the lake, but there was no sense of peace or tranquility. The water was dark, almost murky, and the trees on the opposite side seemed to lean over the shore in a way that was unsettling. No animals, no birds, nothing. Just the stillness. We set up camp, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As evening approached, the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally. The campfire crackled, its light flickering against the darkening woods. We ate our food in silence, no one really speaking. I kept looking around, half expecting to see something, anything move, but nothing did. The only sound was the occasional snap of a twig breaking in the distance. It wasn't until later, when the fire had burned down to embers, that things took a turn. Dan went to fetch more wood for the fire, leaving me sitting alone. I was trying to shake off my growing discomfort, but the silence, the complete lack of sound, only amplified it. I leaned back against a tree, staring into the dark, when I heard something. A rustle, soft, deliberate. It was coming from the woods. I stood up slowly, straining my ears. There it was again. A movement. Not like an animal, but like something walking, something human. My heart rate quickened. It was too far off to see anything, but the noise continued, getting closer. I called out for Dan, but my voice seemed to get swallowed by the trees. The rustling stopped, and I was left standing there, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. After a moment, Dan returned, carrying an armful of logs. I told him about what I'd heard, but he just shrugged it off. "It's probably a deer or something. These woods play tricks on your ears," he said. Tossing a log into the fire, I wasn't convinced, but I let it go. We sat back down, the fire crackling between us. But the feeling I had, that sense of being watched, didn't leave. I kept glancing into the woods, expecting to see eyes glowing in the dark. Nothing, just the black void of the forest. As the hours passed, we eventually decided to turn in. The tent felt safer, more enclosed. I crawled inside and zipped it shut, trying to ignore the strange feeling that lingered in my chest. I lay there, trying to fall asleep, but every noise, every rustle, made my heart race. I don't know how much time passed, but I was jolted awake by a sound, a loud crack of a branch snapping, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow. My pulse shot up. I lay still, listening intently. The steps weren't like those of an animal. They were too deliberate, too human. They were right outside the tent. I held my breath, trying to hear more clearly. The steps stopped for a moment, and I swore I could hear breathing. Deep, slow, almost rhythmic. I reached over to where Dan was sleeping, shaking him gently.
Dan, he whispered urgently.
Dan, wake up. But there was no response. I shook him harder, my panic rising. Still nothing. The footsteps continued, circling the tent now. I was terrified. My mind raced. Who could it be? Was it a hunter? Someone lost in the woods? Maybe someone else camping nearby? But why were they so close to our camp? The breathing stopped. The footsteps stopped. It was too quiet. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know what was happening. Slowly, I unzipped the tent, just enough to poke my head out. My eyes scanned the surrounding darkness. Nothing. The fire was nearly out, leaving only faint embers glowing red. The trees loomed above us, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. I stepped out cautiously. I whispered Dan's name again, but it felt like the forest swallowed my words. As I walked toward the fire, I felt it, an overwhelming sense of being watched, like there were eyes on the back of my neck. The firelight flickered, casting strange shadows on the ground. And then I saw it, a figure, standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Tall, unnaturally still. I couldn't make out any details, but the shape was clear. The figure was human, but there was something off about it. Something that sent a chill through me. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring that I froze, heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced for an explanation. A person lost in the woods, maybe? But why was it standing so still, not saying anything? I called out, "Hello? Is someone out there?" My voice was shaky, barely a whisper. No response. I slowly backed toward the tent, my eyes never leaving the figure. My mind screamed at me to get inside, to lock the door, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. The figure didn't follow. It just stayed there, watching. And then, without any warning, it turned and walked into the woods, slowly, deliberately, as though it had no fear of being seen.
No rush.
I didn't wait to see where it went. I ran back to the tent, ripped open the zipper, and dove inside. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I shook Dan awake, finally, and told him everything. He didn't believe me at first, not until he stepped outside, looked around, and saw the footprints. Large, uneven steps leading into the woods, and the unmistakable marks of something or someone moving near the fire. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. We didn't sleep, didn't speak. We just waited, listening for anything, any sound, any movement. But nothing came. The next morning, we packed up and left. We didn't speak much, but we didn't need to. The woods felt different now, no longer peaceful but oppressive. We hiked back the way we came, not looking back until we reached the trailhead. When we got back to the car, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder one last time, just to make sure. But there was nothing, just the forest, as quiet as it had been the day before. And even though nothing had happened, I never went back to that place. Some things, I guess, are better left alone. It was supposed to be just a weekend getaway, something to clear my head. My friends had been suggesting we go camping for a while, and after weeks of trying to find some time away from work, I decided to go. We had all been talking about it as a way to get back to nature, disconnect, and just relax for a couple of days. Nothing too intense, just the usual hike, set up the tent, cook over a fire, and spend the night under the stars. Simple enough, or so I thought. The plan was to drive up to a national park about 3 hours from our town. It wasn't the most popular spot, but that's exactly why we chose it. We figured there'd be fewer people, more peace, and less noise from other campers. We were looking forward to the solitude. I remember the drive up. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, and the sky turned into a canvas of orange and purple streaks. The road wound its way through thick woods, with towering trees on either side, their branches stretching out like hands, trying to grab at the car. As we got closer to the park, the air grew colder, and the last traces of daylight disappeared. We parked at the trailhead, where we planned to set up camp. It was a quiet place, the kind of place where you could hear your own heartbeat when everything else was still. We unloaded the car, grabbed our gear, and started the short hike to the campsite. There were no other cars parked at the trailhead, which only added to the feeling that we were completely alone. As we hiked, the forest closed in around us. The tall trees blocked out most of the moonlight, leaving the path ahead lit only by our flashlights. The sound of our boots crunching on the gravel trail seemed too loud against the silence of the woods. It took us about 20 minutes to get to the campsite, a small clearing with a fire pit and a flat area for tents. We spread out our gear, setting up camp quickly, eager to start a fire and get some food going. By the time the tent was up and the fire crackling, it was completely dark. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were the only person in the world. But there was something else too, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to stretch too far, or how the wind would stop suddenly, leaving everything eerily still. But I pushed those thoughts aside, convincing myself that it was just my imagination. We ate, laughed, and told stories around the fire. Felt good to disconnect from everything for a while. But as the night wore on, I started to feel a strange tension in the air. It was subtle at first, like a knot in the pit of my stomach. My friends didn't seem to notice it, though. They were too busy talking and joking around, and I didn't want to ruin the mood by bringing it up. After a while, the conversation died down, and we all sat in silence, listening to the crackling fire. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or some small creature. A twig snapping, then the faint rustling of leaves. It was coming from the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of our firelight. My eyes darted toward the dark woods, trying to see if I could spot anything moving. But all I saw was the blackness, deep and impenetrable. I stayed quiet, hoping it was just an animal, but the sound came again. This time it was clearer. It wasn't the light rustle of small creatures, but something bigger, something moving deliberately. My heart started to race. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. They looked at me, confused, like they hadn't heard anything out of the ordinary. I could feel my pulse quicken as I strained my ears, listening intently. The sound stopped for a moment, but then it came again, louder this time. A soft shuffle, like something dragging along the ground, followed by a faint crunch of leaves. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle on me. My friends must have noticed my change in posture, because they all turned to look at me. But before I could say anything, the sound stopped. "I'm probably just being paranoid," I said, sitting back down. "It's probably just a deer or something." But even as I said the words, I didn't believe them. The woods around us felt too still, too silent. And then I heard it again, this time from a different direction. A snap, then a rustle. It was coming from further into the trees, beyond the clearing. This time, I didn't wait for anyone to acknowledge it. I grabbed the flashlight, shining it into the dark woods. The beam of light cut through the blackness, but there was nothing. No eyes reflecting back at me, no movement. Just the thick, oppressive darkness of the forest. Maybe we should check the perimeter, I suggested, my voice a little shaky now. Make sure nothing's around. One of my friends laughed, trying to brush it off. You're paranoid, man. It's just a couple of animals. But there was something in his eyes that told me he wasn't entirely convinced either. Still, no one else moved, and the moment passed. We went back to the fire, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The night dragged on, the wind picking up again, but it still felt off. Every little noise seemed amplified in the silence of the woods. The fire crackled, and the shadows around us stretched and shifted, the trees groaning and creaking in the wind. At some point, we all went to bed. I remember lying in my sleeping bag, listening to the wind outside, the occasional rustle of the trees. But sleep didn't come easily. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps outside the tent. Heavy, slow steps crunching in the dirt. My heart hammered in my chest as I lay completely still, barely breathing. I could feel my body tense, every muscle screaming at me to move, to do something, but I stayed frozen. The footsteps circled the tent, slowly, deliberately, and I could hear the faint scrape of something against the fabric, something big dragging across the ground. I wanted to scream, to wake everyone up, but I couldn't. My throat felt tight, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The steps stopped for a moment, and I held my breath, straining to listen. And then it started again, closer this time, right next to the tent. I could hear it breathing, slow, deliberate. My stomach churned as I realized something was outside, something human-sized, and it was right next to us. I had no idea how long I lay there, too terrified to move. My mind raced with every possible explanation, none of which seemed even remotely possible. But then the footsteps stopped, and for a long while everything was still. Not even the wind moved through the trees. It was only when the sun began to rise, and the first light of day touched the edges of the clearing, that I dared to leave the tent. I grabbed my flashlight again and rushed outside, my heart still racing. There was no sign of anyone, no tracks, no footprints, nothing that could explain what had happened. The only thing I could find was a broken branch near the edge of the clearing, and the remnants of something scraped against the dirt, like something large had dragged something heavy across the ground. We packed up and left early the next morning, none of us saying much. No one questioned what had happened the night before, but the air between us was different. The tension that had been hanging over us the night before was still there, thick and heavy. When we got back to the trailhead, the car was still the only one parked there. No one else had been up there that weekend. To this day, I don't know what happened out there, what we heard, or what was circling our camp in the night. But I do know that I've never been camping again. Some things, once you experience them, are hard to forget. I can still hear those footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing in my mind. The memory of them, of whatever was out there, never really leaves me. And every time I step into the woods now, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching, waiting. It was supposed to be just a weekend getaway, something to clear my head. My friends had been suggesting we go camping for a while, and after weeks of trying to find some time away from work, I decided to go. We had all been talking about it as a way to get back to nature, disconnect, and just relax for a couple of days. Nothing too intense, just the usual hike, set up the tent, cook over a fire, and spend the night under the stars. Simple enough, or so I thought. The plan was to drive up to a national park about 3 hours from our town. It wasn't the most popular spot, but that's exactly why we chose it. We figured there'd be fewer people, more peace, and less noise from other campers. We were looking forward to the solitude. I remember the drive up. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, and the sky turned into a canvas of orange and purple streaks. The road wound its way through thick woods, with towering trees on either side, their branches stretching out like hands, trying to grab at the car. As we got closer to the park, the air grew colder, and the last traces of daylight disappeared. We parked at the trailhead, where we planned to set up camp. It was a quiet place, the kind of place where you could hear your own heartbeat when everything else was still. We unloaded the car, grabbed our gear, and started the short hike to the campsite. There were no other cars parked at the trailhead, which only added to the feeling that we were completely alone. As we hiked, the forest closed in around us. The tall trees blocked out most of the moonlight, leaving the path ahead lit only by our flashlights. The sound of our boots crunching on the gravel trail seemed too loud against the silence of the woods. It took us about 20 minutes to get to the campsite, a small clearing with a fire pit and a flat area for tents. We spread out our gear, setting up camp quickly, eager to start a fire and get some food going. By the time the tent was up and the fire crackling, it was completely dark. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were the only person in the world. But there was something else too, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to stretch too far, or how the wind would stop suddenly, leaving everything eerily still. But I pushed those thoughts aside, convincing myself that it was just my imagination. We ate, laughed, and told stories around the fire. It felt good to disconnect from everything for a while. But as the night wore on, I started to feel a strange tension in the air. It was subtle at first, like a knot in the pit of my stomach. My friends didn't seem to notice it, though. They were too busy talking and joking around, and I didn't want to ruin the mood by bringing it up. After a while, the conversation died down, and we all sat in silence, listening to the crackling fire. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or some small creature. A twig snapping, then the faint rustling of leaves. It was coming from the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of our firelight. My eyes darted toward the dark woods, trying to see if I could spot anything moving, but all I saw was the blackness, deep and impenetrable. I stayed quiet, hoping it was just an animal, but the sound came again. This time it was clearer. It wasn't the light rustle of small creatures, but something bigger, something moving deliberately. My heart started to race. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. They looked at me, confused, like they hadn't heard anything out of the ordinary. I could feel my pulse quicken as I strained my ears, listening intently. The sound stopped for a moment, but then it came again, louder this time. A soft shuffle, like something dragging along the ground, followed by a faint crunch of leaves. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle on me. My friends must have noticed my change in posture, because they all turned to look at me. But before I could say anything, the sound stopped. "I'm probably just being paranoid," I said, sitting back down. "It's probably just a deer or something." But even as I said the words, I didn't believe them. The woods around us felt too still, too silent. And then I heard it again, this time from a different direction. A snap, then a rustle. It was coming from further into the trees, beyond the clearing. This time, I didn't wait for anyone to acknowledge it. I grabbed the flashlight, shining it into the dark woods. The beam of light cut through the blackness, but there was nothing. No eyes reflecting back at me, no movement. Just the thick, oppressive darkness of the forest. "Maybe we should check the perimeter," I suggested, my voice a little shaky now. "Make sure nothing's around." One of my friends laughed, trying to brush it off. "You're paranoid, man. It's just a couple of animals." But there was something in his eyes that told me he wasn't entirely convinced either. Still, no one else moved, and the moment passed. We went back to the fire, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The night dragged on, the wind picking up again, but it still felt off. Every little noise seemed amplified in the silence of the woods. The fire crackled, and the shadows around us stretched and shifted, the trees groaning and creaking in the wind. At some point, we all went to bed. I remember lying in my sleeping bag, listening to the wind outside, the occasional rustle of the trees. But sleep didn't come easily. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps outside the tent. Heavy, slow steps crunching in the dirt. My heart hammered in my chest as I lay completely still, barely breathing. I could feel my body tense, every muscle screaming at me to move, to do something, but I stayed frozen. The footsteps circled the tent, slowly, deliberately, and I could hear the faint scrape of something against the fabric. Something big dragging across the ground. I wanted to scream, to wake everyone up, but I couldn't. My throat felt tight, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The steps stopped for a moment, and I held my breath, straining to listen. And then it started again, closer this time, right next to the tent. I could hear it breathing, slow, deliberate. My stomach churned as I realized something was outside, something human-sized, and it was right next to us. I had no idea how long I lay there, too terrified to move. My mind raced with every possible explanation, none of which seemed even remotely possible. But then the footsteps stopped, and for a long while everything was still. Not even the wind moved through the trees. It was only when the sun began to rise, and the first light of day touched the edges of the clearing, that I dared to leave the tent. I grabbed my flashlight again and rushed outside, my heart still racing. There was no sign of anyone, no tracks, no footprints, nothing that could explain what had happened. The only thing I could find was a broken branch near the edge of the clearing, and the remnants of something scraped against the dirt, like something large had dragged something heavy across the ground. We packed up and left early the next morning, none of us saying much. No one questioned what had happened the night before, but the air between us was different. The tension that had been hanging over us the night before was still there, thick and heavy. When we got back to the trailhead, the car was still the only one parked there. No one else had been up there that weekend. To this day, I don't know what happened out there, what we heard, or what was circling our camp in the night. But I do know that I've never been camping again. Some things, once you experience them, are hard to forget. I can still hear those footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing in my mind. The memory of them, of whatever was out there, never really leaves me. And every time I step into the woods now, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching, waiting. I was never much of an outdoors person, but when my friends suggested a camping trip, I reluctantly agreed. It was supposed to be an easy weekend getaway to clear our heads, escape from work, and reconnect with nature. I should have known from the start that it would turn out differently. What seemed like a fun, simple trip quickly turned into a nightmarish experience that still haunts me to this day. We chose a remote location, a national park about 4 hours out of the city, known for its quiet beauty and lack of foot traffic. We wanted to avoid the usual crowded campsites, the noise, and the rangers who seemed to ruin the wild aspect of camping. None of us had ever been there before, but we figured we'd find our way, as most people do when they go camping. I should have listened to that gut feeling that kept telling me something wasn't right. The drive was long, and by the time we reached the campsite, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. There were 3 of us. Mark, the adventurous one, always pushing for something extreme. Lily, a nature enthusiast who loved hiking but wasn't used to being off the beaten path. And me, someone who liked the idea of camping but wasn't exactly thrilled about spending the night in the middle of nowhere. We set up camp near a small creek, where the sound of water flowing through the rocks would be our background music for the evening. The air was crisp and cool, but nothing unusual. Mark started a fire while Lily began organizing the gear. As for me, I did what I always do: set up the tent and tried to ignore the gnawing feeling in my stomach. My unease wasn't from anything specific, but the isolation started to sink in. We were miles from civilization, with only the trees and the distant hum of wildlife around us. As night fully settled, the forest around us grew quiet. The wind rustled the leaves, but other than that, there were no sounds of other campers or distant voices. It was just the three of us in a deep, dark wilderness. We ate a simple dinner of hot dogs and beans, and the conversation was lighthearted. We cracked a few beers, joked about nothing, and stared into the fire. But the more I stared into the flames, the more I started to feel something was off. The stillness of the forest was unnerving. I told myself it was just my nerves. After all, we were in a national park. What could go wrong? By the time we finished eating, it was well past midnight. Mark suggested we go for a short walk, but Lily and I were both too tired. I told him to go ahead without us. He shrugged and grabbed his flashlight, disappearing into the darkness with a quick, "Be right back." As the minutes ticked by, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of a branch in the wind. I kept checking the time. 30 minutes passed, then an hour. Still no sign of Mark. I figured he'd gotten lost in the dark or had taken longer than expected. I wasn't too worried yet, but a part of me felt unsettled, a gnawing feeling at the back of my mind telling me something wasn't right. Lily seemed fine, though. She was curled up in her sleeping bag, reading a book with the faint light of the fire. I tried to relax, but my thoughts kept returning to Mark. Had he tripped? Hurt himself? Maybe he just lost track of time, I told myself. But why hadn't he called out? After another 20 minutes, I couldn't sit still anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up. "I'm going to check on Mark," I said to Lily, who only nodded absently. I walked to the edge of the campsite, peering into the dark forest. The trees were thick, and the only path was the one we'd walked earlier. I hesitated, but then started toward the path. The forest was eerily quiet, and with each step I took, the air seemed to grow colder, heavier. My breath puffed in the air like smoke, and I found myself scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. I called Mark's name a few times, but my voice seemed to get swallowed by the forest. I kept walking, my boots crunching on the leaves and twigs, my flashlight beam flickering as I passed through patches of thick trees. The path twisted and turned, and I realized that I had walked farther than I meant to. Still no sign of him. I was about to turn back when I heard a sound, a rustling like something or someone moving through the underbrush. My heart raced. I aimed the flashlight in the direction of the noise, but all I saw was the shifting of trees and shadows. There was no sign of Mark, no trail of footprints or any other evidence that someone had been there. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Suddenly, I heard it again. This time, it was much closer. Something large moving through the trees, breaking twigs, snapping branches. My pulse quickened. It was too loud to be an animal, and the way it moved was unnerving. It was deliberate, like whatever it was trying to avoid making too much noise, but also had no intention of hiding. I stood frozen for a moment, the beam of the flashlight shaking in my hand. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. I called out again, but the words barely left my mouth before the sound stopped. The forest went quiet again. I strained my ears, hoping to hear something, anything, but there was nothing. I was standing alone in the woods, heart pounding in my chest, feeling like I was being watched. That's when the first real panic set in. I turned around and rushed back to camp, my breath coming in short bursts. I hadn't gone too far, but the feeling of being pursued made every step feel like a mile. When I reached the camp, I found Lily sitting up, wide-eyed, the fire dimming as the logs burned low. "Where's Mark?" she asked, her voice shaky. "I don't know," I admitted, my own voice trembling. I think something's out there." Lily's face drained of color, but before she could say anything else, we heard something. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from the dark. We both stood frozen, straining our ears, eyes wide in terror. The footsteps stopped just outside the light of the fire. Then we saw him. Mark stumbled into the clearing, his clothes dirty and torn, his face pale and streaked with dirt. His eyes were wide, panicked, but he was breathing heavily, as if he'd been running. "What happened?" I rushed to him, but he didn't answer. He just kept looking over his shoulder into the forest, his eyes darting around nervously. I don't know," he finally said, his voice shaky. I heard something out there. It was following me." His words came out in a whisper, like he was afraid someone might overhear him. "Mark, what are you talking about?" I asked, but I could already see that something was wrong. His entire demeanor had changed. He wasn't the same confident, adventurous friend he had been earlier. He was terrified. "I heard it," he said, almost pleading. It was like footsteps, but not human. They were too slow, too deliberate, like it was waiting for me to make a mistake. I thought I was being hunted. We all stood in silence for a moment. The fire crackled as we tried to make sense of his words. I didn't know what was going on, but I could feel the tension in the air. There was something out there, something that wasn't right. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, keeping the fire alive. I didn't sleep, couldn't. Every rustle, every crack of a branch sent my heart into overdrive. The hours dragged on, and with every passing minute, the dark forest outside our camp seemed to close in around us. The next morning, we packed up and left. We didn't even discuss what happened. We just left in silence, driving away from that place as fast as we could. It's been months since that night, and I've tried to forget, but I can't. I keep asking myself if Mark really saw something, or if the fear got the best of him. But part of me knows that something was out there, something that was watching us, something that was patient and willing to wait. We never went back to that park, and to this day, I can't shake the feeling that there's something out there in the woods, something that knows when you're afraid, something that waits. But one thing's for sure, we were never meant to find out what it was. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks, a break from everything. No phones, no emails, just me, nature, and a tent tucked away in a quiet corner of the forest. The area wasn't exactly well known, but that's what appealed to me. I didn't want to see anyone. I wanted peace and quiet. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon as I arrived at the campsite. The forest was dense, the trees towering high above me, their shadows stretching long over the dirt trail. I pulled my truck off the road, onto a small clearing by the river, and shut off the engine. The stillness was immediate, almost unnerving, but I pushed it aside. I had been in nature before. I had camped in places far more remote than this. It was just the transition from city noise to complete silence that always caught me off guard. Setting up camp was simple.
Tent, sleeping bag, cooler, stove.
I packed light, just enough to get by for a few days. The night was creeping in fast, and soon the only light came from my lantern and the dying glow of the sunset. It was peaceful, but there was a strange feeling in the air, a kind of tension, like something was waiting for me. I sat by the fire after dinner, the only sound the crackle of the wood and the occasional splash of water from the river. I tried not to think too much about the odd feeling gnawing at me. Maybe it was just the isolation, or maybe it was the fact that the forest felt too still, too quiet. Then I heard it, a snap of a twig, but it didn't sound like it came from the forest. It sounded close, too close. I turned my head sharply toward the sound, but saw nothing. No movement, no figure. I stood up, scanning the area. The firelight flickered, casting shadows that danced across the trees, but everything remained still. I told myself I was being paranoid. Animals lived in these woods, deer, foxes, maybe a bear or two. Nothing to worry about. But still, that snap had unnerved me that I sat back down and forced myself to focus on the fire. I wasn't going to let some noise ruin my trip. I threw another log on the fire to keep it from dying out, its light bathing the campsite in a warm, orange glow. The night deepened. It was just me now, alone with the dark. The kind of darkness that was thick and heavy, like the forest had swallowed up all sound. I glanced at the time, nearly 11 p.m. I hadn't realized how late it had gotten. Maybe I was just tired, my mind playing tricks on me. It had been a long drive, and I had planned to go to bed early. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The rustling came again. This time, it was unmistakable. It was too consistent to be an animal. It wasn't a gentle rustling of leaves or a shifting of the wind. It was the sound of something or someone moving through the brush, deliberately, slowly, as if trying to avoid detection. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The fire crackled again, the flames licking higher, but the sound of movement didn't stop. I stood up, grabbed the small flashlight from my bag, and clicked it on. The beam cut through the dark, but there was nothing, only trees and shadows. I walked toward the noise, each step feeling heavier, the thumping of my heart growing louder in my chest. The beam of light bounced erratically as I tried to hold it steady, but it was impossible to see much beyond the immediate area around the campsite. The forest felt like it stretched on forever, and in that darkness, anything could be hiding. The sound stopped, just like that, complete silence again. I was standing at the edge of the clearing now, flashlight held high, but I couldn't see anything. The forest was still. I couldn't tell whether I was relieved or more unsettled. Part of me wanted to believe it was nothing, just a figment of my imagination. But another part of me, a quieter, more instinctual part, was telling me that something was wrong. I stayed out there for another 10 minutes, scanning the trees. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush made me jump, but nothing showed itself. Finally, I decided it was enough. Maybe I'd just been hearing things. Maybe the wind had been playing tricks on me. I turned back toward the fire, but before I could make it halfway, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't alone. Someone or something was behind me that I spun around, shining the flashlight everywhere. But once again, there was nothing. Nothing but the trees and the shifting shadows. My pulse was racing now, and my thoughts were scattered. I couldn't tell if I was losing my mind or if something was really out there, watching. The next few hours were a blur. I barely slept, and the sounds of the forest outside my tent kept me on edge. It was the kind of sleep where you drift in and out of consciousness, always half awake, straining to hear the slightest noise, always on alert. Morning came at last, bringing with it the sound of birds and the light of dawn breaking through the canopy above. I sat up in my tent, my body sore from lack of proper rest. I stretched, blinking at the light filtering in through the small gaps in the fabric. My mind was still foggy from the night, but as I packed up my things, the nagging feeling didn't leave. In fact, it seemed to only grow stronger as the day went on. I took one last look around the campsite, feeling a strange sense of unease. Something wasn't right here. Maybe it was just the remoteness of the place, the isolation. But as I drove away, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror. I thought I saw movement in the trees, something dark, a shadow. I shook my head, trying to clear the thought. It was just my mind playing tricks on me again. The sun was rising, the road was quiet, and I was safe. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't need to, but I knew I'd never go back to that place. Something out there in those woods had made its presence known, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what it was. I had always loved camping. The fresh air, the sounds of nature, the calm away from city life. There was something about it that helped me unwind. So, when I had the chance to get away for a weekend, I packed up my gear and headed out to a remote site deep in the woods. I had done this plenty of times before. My friends always joked that I was the survivalist of the group, always knowing where to set up camp, how to start a fire, or where to find a safe place to sleep. This trip, though, was just me. I wanted to be alone to clear my mind. The trail to the campsite was long, about a 5-mile hike through dense trees and uneven ground. The weather was perfect. The sun was still high, but the air had the slight chill of early autumn. I had made a quick stop at a small town on my way to pick up some supplies: water, snacks, and some firewood. The town was quiet, with no one around but a few scattered hikers and locals. By the time I reached the campsite, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows on the trees. The air felt heavier now, as if the forest had swallowed the daylight. The campgrounds weren't exactly official, meaning no rangers or facilities, just a small, flat clearing with a fire ring and a decent spot for my tent. It was perfect. I set up quickly, enjoying the peace of being alone. As the light faded, I made a fire, the crackling of the logs the only sound around me. I had brought a book to read, but the stillness kept pulling my attention away. The woods had a sort of oppressive quiet, like they were watching, waiting for something. I chalked it up to just my imagination. After all, the woods could feel eerily quiet at night, especially when there was no wind. That's when I heard it. At first, it was a rustling in the underbrush, far off in the distance. Maybe an animal, I thought, but then it came closer. The noise was soft, almost too soft to be anything more than a trick of the wind. But there it was again, a crack of a twig breaking, and then the rustling grew louder, like something was moving through the forest toward me. I froze, my heart racing a little. It wasn't the typical sound of animals. This was deliberate, slow, methodical. I stood up from my seat near the fire, straining to listen. My first thought was that maybe a bear or some other animal was coming closer. I grabbed a flashlight from my pack, shining it into the trees. But nothing, just the shadows, the flickering firelight bouncing off the trunks of the trees. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I sat back down and tried to focus on the fire, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something felt off, like I wasn't alone. I grabbed the knife from my pocket, a habit from years of hiking in remote areas. I wasn't scared, not really, just aware. I didn't hear anything for a while after that. The forest returned to its usual quiet. Maybe it was just a deer or even a raccoon. I tried to push the thought out of my head and focused on the fire instead, using the warmth to stave off the growing chill in the air. But then, just as I was about to relax, I heard it again. This time it was closer, much closer. It wasn't the rustling of leaves or the crack of a branch. It was footsteps, the unmistakable sound of someone walking through the woods. Slow, deliberate steps, too heavy to be a small animal and too precise to be the random shuffle of the wind. These steps were controlled, like someone knew exactly where they were going. I felt a cold knot of dread in my stomach. My mind raced through the possibilities. There were no other campers here. I had passed a few hikers on the way in, but they were far behind me by now, and no one else had passed me on the trail. I was sure of it. But there was someone out there now, in the darkness, moving toward me. The fire crackled as I stood up once again, this time more cautiously. I grabbed the flashlight, shining it into the trees, but there was no one there, just the shadows. My pulse hammered in my ears as I scanned the surroundings, every inch of the forest feeling like it was closing in. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't scared, at least I didn't think I was, but something was definitely off. I decided to wait for whatever it was to show itself. I sat down on a log near the fire, trying to look as calm as possible, but every instinct screamed at me to pack up and leave. But no, I wasn't going to let fear drive me off. I had come here for solitude, and I wasn't going to let some noise ruin that. I kept the knife close, the flashlight in my lap, and stared at the fire, hoping whatever it was would just go away. The night dragged on, but the footsteps didn't return. I sat there, staring into the flames, too afraid to sleep but too exhausted to stay fully alert. It was around midnight when I finally decided to lie down. Maybe it was just a person on the trail or some animal, nothing to be afraid of. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up tight, listening to the sounds of the night. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing things outside the tent. Soft noises, rustling, the crack of another branch breaking, and then a tap, just one. A single, soft tap against the side of the tent, like someone was knocking on it. I held my breath, straining to listen. The noise came again, softer this time, almost as if the person was trying to be quiet. I grabbed the flashlight, shining it directly at the side of the tent. But there was nothing there. The knot in my stomach tightened, and I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around me. I was on edge now, heart racing, as I lay there listening to the night around me. The tapping stopped, but the sounds didn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And then it happened. I heard something unmistakable. The zipper of my tent started to move. Slowly, carefully I froze, staring at the dark fabric of the tent door. Whoever or whatever was outside was trying to get in. The flashlight fell from my hand, hitting the floor with a soft thud, but I didn't care. My breath came in shallow gasps as I waited, heart pounding. The zipper moved again, inch by inch, as if someone was deliberately trying to open it. I wasn't sure what to do. My mind raced, too fast to process anything. Should I call out? But what if it was a person and not some random hiker? Should I confront them? The thought of facing whoever it was in the dark made my stomach turn. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the zipper stopped. The tent door held still. I lay there for what felt like hours, too scared to move. But then, with no more noise, sleep finally took over, though I didn't feel safe. I kept waking up in the dark, every noise outside making my heart race again. Each time I would lie perfectly still, listening for the sound of footsteps or the rustle of fabric. But nothing came. When morning finally came, I wasted no time packing up my tent and gear. I had no idea who or what had been outside my tent that night, but I was done. I was getting out of there. As I walked back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be following me, but the woods remained empty. Eventually, I reached my car, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. I wasn't sure what I had experienced. My rational mind told me it was probably just another camper or a group of animals. But deep down, something about it didn't sit right. I couldn't explain it. The way the footsteps had sounded, the way the tent zipper had moved. It wasn't just an animal. It wasn't just a coincidence. It felt too deliberate. I left the forest that day, vowing never to return to that particular campsite. I didn't need to know what had really happened. I was just happy to be leaving it behind. It wasn't the first time I had camped alone, and it wouldn't be the last. But something told me that next time, I'd pick a much more populated site. The thing is, I still don't know what it was. Maybe it was someone who got lost, or maybe it was an animal I couldn't see. But whatever it was, I wasn't taking any chances again. Not in those woods. I never thought camping could go so wrong. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. Just me, the open woods, a small tent, and the quiet of nature. I needed this. Just some time alone to clear my mind and get away from the chaos of city life. The plan was simple. Hike to a remote spot, set up camp, and enjoy a few days of solitude. I've done it 100 times before, but this time was different. This time, I was going to face something I couldn't explain. I arrived at the park late Friday afternoon. The place was eerily empty, but that didn't bother me. If anything, it was a relief. I didn't want to be bothered by other campers. I liked the idea of being alone in the woods, not having to listen to the chatter of others around a campfire or deal with the noise of other tents flapping in the wind. I grabbed my backpack, slung it over my shoulder, and set off down the well-worn trail that would take me to a small clearing by a stream where I'd set up camp. As I walked, the forest began to feel different. The air was thick and humid, and the trees seemed to close in around me. The wind whispered through the branches, but there wasn't any sign of rain. It was just heavy. The sounds of wildlife were there. Birds calling in the distance, the occasional rustling in the underbrush. But something felt off. It was like the forest was holding its breath. I shook it off as nothing more than my imagination running wild. I was alone, after all, and when you're alone, your mind tends to wander. The further I went, the quieter it became. The usual noise of insects, birds, and small animals seemed to fade away, replaced by an uncomfortable stillness. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I forced myself to keep walking, trying to shake off the unease building in my chest. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun had started to dip behind the treetops. The soft glow of twilight was creeping in, casting long shadows across the ground. I set up my tent quickly, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my stomach. It was just the isolation getting to me, I told myself. I was fine. Everything was fine. As night fell, the darkness seemed to stretch out further than it should. I had a fire going, its flickering light casting strange, dancing shadows around me. The crackling of the flames was the only sound now, and I leaned back, staring into the fire, trying to distract myself from the growing sense of dread gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. That's when I heard it. At first, it was just a soft rustling in the bushes near the edge of the clearing. A deer, maybe, or some other small animal. But then the rustling stopped, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was moving around the perimeter of the camp. My heart started to race. I stood up, scanning the darkness around me, but saw nothing. Just the trees, the flickering shadows, the fire crackling softly. I tried to brush it off as nothing, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. It was as though eyes were boring into me from every direction, waiting for me to make a move. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind, made my pulse quicken. It was stupid, I told myself. I was just paranoid. There were no people out here, no one around for miles. But then the sound came again, this time closer. A twig snapped underfoot. Not a small one, but a large, deliberate snap. I froze, staring into the darkness, but there was nothing. Nothing but the trees, the shadows, and the quiet. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to steady my nerves. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag, but before I turned it on, I heard something else. A voice, muffled but unmistakable. It was a low murmur, like a whisper, but it wasn't a language I recognized. It was strange, guttural, almost like a growl mixed with words. I couldn't make out the specifics, but it was enough to send a cold chill straight through me. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to pack up and head back to the trail, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were cemented to the ground. My eyes darted around the clearing, desperately searching for anything, anyone, that could explain the noise. But there was nothing. The whisper came again, clearer this time, and my heart skipped a beat. It was almost like it was right next to me, just out of my sight. Help me? I didn't know if it was the wind, my imagination, or something else entirely, but the words chilled me to the core. I snapped on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, but all I saw were the shadows of trees swaying in the breeze. Nothing else. I shone the light toward the bushes where I'd heard the rustling earlier, but there was nothing there either. No movement, no signs of anything. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I sat back down by the fire, trying to calm myself. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I didn't want to make any rash decisions. I tried to focus on the fire, on the small, comforting crackle of the flames, but the unease only grew. The hours stretched on. The whispering, the rustling, the feeling of being watched. It all continued, building, intensifying, until I could barely think straight. I was exhausted, mentally and physically, but every time I tried to close my eyes, I could hear the murmur, the growl, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time, not just a whisper, but a full-fledged voice. This time, it was unmistakable. Get out. The words were clear as day, and they sent a jolt of terror through me. My heart was hammering in my chest. I grabbed my pack, shoved the flashlight inside, and began to break down my tent in a panic. I didn't care what I left behind. I just needed to leave. Now, but as I hurriedly packed up, I realized something that made my blood run cold. I was not alone. The whispering wasn't just in the air, it wasn't just in my head. It was coming from behind me, from somewhere in the trees. The sound of something moving. Slowly, deliberately, I dropped everything and ran. I didn't think. I just ran. Down the trail, through the woods. My breath was ragged, and I could feel my legs burning as I stumbled over roots and rocks. But I didn't care. I didn't stop to look behind me. I just ran. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the park, just outside the forest, that I stopped. I collapsed on the ground, panting, my heart still racing. I looked back toward the dark expanse of the woods, but there was nothing, no movement, no whispering. I wasn't sure what had happened out there, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going back. The next morning, I called the park rangers and told them what had happened. They seemed confused at first, but when I described the location, they told me something I'll never forget. That's the old part of the park, the ranger said. We don't recommend people go out there anymore. There's been a lot of strange activity. People going missing, things happening. We've had to shut it down a few times for safety. I never went camping again after that. Some things I've learned are better left unexplored. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip. Just me, a backpack, and a quiet spot in the woods to get away from the noise of the world for a couple of days. I didn't expect much. Maybe a few good hikes, some time around a campfire, and a chance to clear my head. Nothing crazy, just a break. I left my car parked by the trailhead, a little farther out than most people would go. This wasn't a popular spot. The kind of place that wasn't crowded with families or weekend warriors looking to snap a few photos and then go back to their comfortable beds. I wanted solitude. I had heard about this place from a friend who came here a few months ago, said it was peaceful and quiet. The air was cool, crisp with the faint scent of pine as I set off. The trail was well marked at first, wide enough for a decent hike, with the occasional clearing where you could look out and see the hills rolling away in the distance. The trees were dense here, the kind that towered high above, their canopies blocking out most of the sunlight. A few birds chirped now and then, but other than that, everything felt still. Too still. I couldn't help but notice how quickly the sounds of the outside world seemed to fade as I moved deeper into the forest. I'd been hiking for a couple of hours, and already I was beginning to feel like I was in a different world altogether. There was no hum of cars, no distant drone of people talking. It was just me and the wild. The further I went, the more isolated everything seemed. Eventually, I found a clearing just large enough to set up camp. There was a small stream running through it, a perfect spot to collect water, and the ground was flat enough to pitch my tent. I spent the next hour setting up camp, trying to get everything just right. Tent, fire pit, a few logs for sitting. The quiet was almost deafening, the kind of silence you don't realize you're missing until you've been immersed in it for a while. I sat on one of the logs by the fire pit as the sun started to dip behind the trees. The air began to cool rapidly. I unpacked a little bit of food, nothing too fancy. Some jerky, a few granola bars, and a can of beans that I'd heat up later. It wasn't gourmet, but it'd do. The fire was small but enough to keep away the chill, and I found myself just staring into the flames for a while, letting my mind wander. But as the night fell, something about the forest started to feel off. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint exactly. It was just a subtle shift. The birds stopped singing. The rustling of the leaves slowed down, and in their place, there was an odd kind of quiet that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to brush it off. After all, it was just a forest. But the silence was unnerving, felt too still. I grabbed my flashlight and took a short walk around the camp, just to stretch my legs. The beam of light bounced off tree trunks, casting long shadows across the underbrush. For a moment, I thought I saw movement in the distance, something small darting between the trees. My heart jumped, but I figured it was just a deer or some other animal. Nothing to worry about. When I got back to the fire, I noticed that the logs I had left nearby had been rearranged. They were in a neat little pile, as though someone had carefully stacked them. I froze for a moment, staring at the pile. It wasn't much, just a few logs that had been moved, but I was sure I hadn't left them like that. Couldn't have. I pushed it from my mind, telling myself that maybe the wind had done it, or maybe I had knocked them over earlier without realizing. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to distract myself with a book, but every little sound in the night, branches cracking, leaves crunching underfoot, the distant call of an owl, sounded amplified. It was almost like the forest was alive with something just beyond my sight. I kept glancing around, half expecting to see someone or something lurking at the edge of the light. It wasn't until the wind picked up that I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped it up tight, the warmth of my sleeping bag a small comfort against the creeping unease that had settled in my chest. The wind howled through the trees, and I lay there, wide awake, listening to the forest. The sounds were different now. The wind had stirred something. I could hear twigs snapping in the distance, something heavy moving through the underbrush. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but the noise was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I reached for my flashlight, my hand trembling. I couldn't explain it, but the hair on my arms stood on end. I tried to breathe steadily, but every sound, every rustle, felt like it was getting closer. My mind raced through every possible explanation, but nothing seemed right. My instincts told me something was out there, something watching. I lay there in the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't bring myself to open the tent flap and look outside, but the sound of something moving was unmistakable now. It wasn't an animal. It was too quiet, too careful. And then, a sharp crack, like something stepping on a dry branch, came from just outside my tent. I froze. I held my breath, waiting for the next sound, but there was nothing. Silence again, thick and suffocating. I knew then that I couldn't stay in that tent any longer. My thoughts were racing. What if it was a person? A hunter? Someone lost in the woods? My mind kept running through the possibilities, but none of them made me feel better. I grabbed my pack, pulled out my knife, and unzipped the tent. I poked my head out, scanning the area with my flashlight. Nothing. The clearing was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I stepped outside, every nerve in my body screaming for me to run, but I forced myself to stay calm. The wind had died down, but the air felt unnaturally still. I scanned the tree line, every shadow seeming to shift as I moved the beam of light. That's when I saw it. Two figures standing motionless in the distance. Not moving, just standing there, staring at me. I couldn't make out any details, just the vague shape of them, barely visible in the darkness. I couldn't explain why, but I didn't move. I didn't scream or run. I just stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, watching those shapes. And then, just as quickly as they appeared, they vanished, gone, like they had never been there at all. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, my mind trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. But nothing about it made sense. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I finally turned back to the campsite, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't staying another minute in this place. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking, and made my way back down the trail. The entire time, I felt the weight of eyes on me. But when I finally reached my car, I didn't look back. As I drove away, the forest behind me seemed to exhale a sigh of relief, and the tension that had held my body tight for hours slowly faded. I don't know who or what was in those woods, but I do know one thing. I won't be going back. I didn't expect it to be so quiet. You hear a lot of things about the woods. How the trees make eerie sounds, how the wind whips through the branches, how your mind starts playing tricks on you when you're surrounded by nothing but nature. But it wasn't any of that. It wasn't the wind or the rustling or some unnatural howl that got to me. It was the silence, the kind of silence that presses down on your chest, fills your ears, and keeps you from thinking clearly. I had been planning this trip for weeks. A weekend out in the wilderness, just me, my gear, and the open air. No phones, no distractions, just the sounds of the wild. I drove up to the remote campsite, tucked deep in the woods, where few people venture. It was the perfect spot, off the beaten path, far enough away from the usual crowd. Quiet. Setting up camp was routine. I've done it 100 times before. My tent was up in no time, the campfire crackling, and the night creeping in around me like a blanket. As the first stars began to poke through the dark sky, I sat by the fire, tossing sticks into the flames, watching them twist and burn. The air was crisp, cool enough to make my breath visible in the light of the fire. I was alone, but I didn't mind. The peace of being away from everything felt right. But it wasn't just the peacefulness that lingered in the air. It was something more. It was a heaviness, an odd feeling that I couldn't shake. No matter how much I tried to distract myself with the fire or the surrounding beauty, I glanced around at the dense trees that surrounded the campsite. I couldn't help but notice how still everything was. The usual hum of insects, the scurrying of animals, even the distant cry of an owl, all seemed muted. It was just quiet, too quiet. I figured it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I had been looking forward to this trip for so long. It was hard not to get a little jumpy when everything felt so unfamiliar. So I told myself to relax. The woods were peaceful and nothing would happen. I even chuckled to myself, shaking off the tension in my shoulders. But then something happened. A twig snapped behind me. First, I froze. I had been sitting there for a while, so I couldn't have missed the sound of a twig breaking. And I wasn't imagining things either. It wasn't the wind. No, this was a deliberate step, a heavy one right behind me. I slowly turned my head, scanning the perimeter of my camp. There was nothing but the blackness of the trees. No movement, no sign of life. The campfire flickered, throwing light in every direction, but nothing seemed to disturb the shadows in the trees. I stood up, trying to steady my breath. It's probably an animal, I thought. A deer, maybe, or some other small creature moving through the underbrush. Still, my heart pounded in my chest. There was something off about this, something unsettling about being so isolated, so vulnerable in this place. I walked around the campsite, my boots crunching on the dry leaves. The fire crackled louder in the silence, its flames dancing wildly in the air. I had this sudden urge to check the perimeter to make sure everything was safe. But the longer I stood there, looking into the dark woods, the more I felt like I wasn't alone. I couldn't explain it, but I could feel eyes on me. I forced myself to sit back down by the fire, trying to push the creeping unease away. There was no reason to be paranoid. This was just nature. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The night dragged on, each moment feeling heavier than the last. My mind kept returning to the snap of the twig, to the sensation of being watched. I tried to ignore it, tried to lose myself in the crackle of the fire, but it kept eating at me. Finally, I grabbed my flashlight and decided to walk toward the edge of the camp to get a better look. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the rocks, the ground where the firelight didn't reach. Nothing unusual, just shadows. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, but even that didn't seem to help shake the weight of the stillness. I kept walking, slowly, my eyes darting around, expecting something to jump out at me, but nothing did. The forest was silent again, almost as if it were waiting for something. My flashlight caught something up ahead, a faint glimmer in the distance. Quickened my pace, drawn to it. When I got closer, I realized it was just a rock, partially covered by moss. The glimmer was nothing more than the reflection of my flashlight bouncing off the wet surface. I stood there for a moment, letting out a relieved breath, but the sense of being watched hadn't faded. That's when I heard it, a low growl. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. It came from behind me, just off the edge of the camp where the light from my fire barely reached. My blood ran cold. It was the growl of something big. Not a dog, not a coyote, something much larger. I spun around, shining my flashlight toward the noise, but there was nothing there. My heart thumped wildly in my chest as I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the sound. The growl came again, closer this time, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. This wasn't some animal trying to scare me. This was something else. I bolted back to the camp, grabbing my backpack, my knife, anything I could get my hands on. I wasn't going to stick around to find out what was out there. The fire felt small and useless now. The flames flickered like they were struggling against the darkness, and the shadows around me seemed to stretch longer and longer with each passing second. I grabbed the flashlight and scanned the trees again. The growl came once more, but this time it was closer, much closer. I could hear footsteps now, slow and deliberate, moving around the perimeter of my camp. Whoever or whatever was out there, it was circling me. I wasn't sure what to do. There was no one around for miles. No phone signal, no way to contact anyone. I was completely alone. My options were limited. The only thing I could do was wait for whatever this was to make its move. The footsteps stopped. The growling stopped. And for a moment, everything was still. But then I heard something else. A voice. Not a whisper. Not a shout. Just a voice, distant and muffled, as if it were coming from inside my own head. It was faint at first, but it grew clearer, more urgent. My heart raced. It was telling me to leave, to get out of there, to leave now, and I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my gear, my flashlight, and started running. I didn't care where I went, just away. The flashlight beam bounced wildly as I charged through the underbrush, the trees and rocks passing by in a blur. I didn't stop, couldn't. I don't know how long I ran. The night seemed to stretch on forever. My chest burned, my legs ached, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't afford to stop. I heard something following me, crashing through the woods. I didn't dare look back. Finally, I stumbled upon a road, a narrow dirt path that led out of the woods. I collapsed on the edge, gasping for air, my hands shaking, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know what I had just escaped from, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I didn't return to that campsite. I don't know what it was that was out there, whether it was an animal, a person, or something else entirely. But I do know one thing: the woods can hold secrets, and some of them are better left undisturbed. I made it back to my car, drove away, and didn't look back. The next day, I read about another person who had gone missing in the area. They found their campsite abandoned, the fire still smoldering. I never went camping alone again. The plan was simple. A few of my friends and I wanted to get away for a weekend. No phones, no distractions, just nature. We picked a secluded camping spot in the woods, about 3 hours from the nearest town. It wasn't a designated campsite, just a little clearing near a river. We thought it'd be perfect. Not many people go there, and the remoteness sounded like a good escape. But as we packed the car and headed off, none of us knew that we were stepping into something that would make this trip unforgettable in ways none of us wanted. We arrived just before dusk, the sun sinking low, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The air was crisp, a light breeze tugging at the trees. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and the smell of wet earth mixed with pine. It was exactly what we needed to disconnect. Setting up the tents didn't take long, and as we got everything in place, I couldn't help but notice how quiet the forest was. Not a single bird chirped, no squirrels skittering around. The only sound was the gentle rustling of the trees and the distant flow of the river. "We're gonna be fine," I told myself, brushing off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. It was just my imagination, right? We had a small fire going by the time night fully set in. The fire crackled, sending occasional sparks into the air as we roasted marshmallows and made jokes. It was nice, peaceful even, and for a while, I almost forgot that feeling of unease that had been slowly gnawing at me since we arrived. But then things started to change. It started with the wind. At first, it was light, just a whisper in the branches overhead. But as the evening wore on, it picked up speed, howling through the trees, sending dry leaves scattering across the ground. The fire flickered, casting long shadows that danced eerily in the growing darkness. "You feel that?" asked Mike, one of my friends. I hadn't even realized he had stopped talking until I noticed his gaze fixed on the woods. I followed his eyes, but there was nothing there, just trees and darkness. "Feel what?" I replied, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. Like the air changed or something. It's colder. It was colder. I had to admit the temperature had dropped significantly in just a few minutes. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, the warmth from the fire doing little to push it back. "Probably just the wind," I said, trying to sound confident. "It's normal for it to get colder at night." But even as I said it, I couldn't ignore the growing tension. The wind wasn't just cold. It was unsettling. Felt like it was moving differently, as if it was more than just air. The trees around us started creaking and groaning, bending in ways I hadn't seen before. It didn't seem natural. We sat in silence for a while, each of us feeling it now. The feeling that we weren't alone. The crackling fire was no longer comforting. It was as if the forest was closing in on us. That's when I heard it dot a snap. Not from the fire, but from the woods. A branch, maybe, too close. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned to Mike, who was staring at the same spot in the trees, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice lower than I intended. Mike didn't answer right away, just kept staring, his eyes wide. That's when I heard it again. A soft crack, and then another. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. My mind raced. Couldn't be another camper. The path to our spot was nearly impossible to find unless you knew exactly where you were going. There was no reason anyone else should be out here, especially at this hour. I stood up, looking into the trees, trying to see anything through the darkness. Nothing, but the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it only grew stronger. My stomach twisted, and for the first time, I started to regret coming here. "Let's go inside the tent," I suggested, trying to shake off the fear. We all moved quickly, not speaking much. No one wanted to voice what we were all thinking. We huddled inside the tents, trying to sleep, but no one really did. The sounds from outside grew louder, closer. I could hear branches cracking under heavy weight, footsteps shuffling in the leaves. The wind howled again, but now it seemed to carry a deeper, more ominous sound. A low growl, almost like an animal's. I couldn't tell if it was just the wind or something more. And then came the whispers, barely audible, like someone was speaking just beyond the trees, their voices too low to understand. I could feel my pulse racing. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I knew deep down it wasn't. Around 2 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold night. The fire was nearly out, but I could still see the faint outline of the camp. Everything felt so still, but it wasn't peaceful. It was too still. There were no animal sounds, no rustling of leaves in the wind, nothing. Then I saw something. At the edge of the trees, a shadow. I blinked, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the firelight. But no, it was too distinct. The shape of a figure, standing completely still, just outside the reach of the firelight. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I wasn't imagining it. There was something out there watching us. I stepped back, slowly, into the tent, zipping it shut. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Should I wake the others? What if it was just a person who had gotten lost? But it didn't feel like a lost camper. Felt wrong. The whispers started again, louder this time. It wasn't the wind. Someone or something was out there. The air felt thick, oppressive. My mind raced, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. I didn't sleep that night. The morning came slowly, the gray light of dawn creeping into the tent. I lay there, wide-eyed, exhausted from the night, but too scared to let myself relax. We all stayed quiet, avoiding eye contact. We didn't need to speak. We all knew something wasn't right. I convinced myself to go out to check the area. Maybe we were just being paranoid. Maybe there was an explanation. I stepped outside, cautiously, and immediately noticed the broken branches scattered around the clearing. They weren't there before. Something had moved through the camp. Something big. The others followed me out, and together we walked toward the spot where I had seen the shadow. But when we got there, there was nothing. No sign of a person, no tracks, nothing but trees and leaves. It was as if the night had erased everything. We decided to pack up and leave. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. In fact, it only intensified the longer we stayed. The forest felt wrong. Every rustling leaf, every broken twig, felt like it was deliberate, like it was meant to scare us. As we packed up the last of our gear, I noticed something on the ground. A small rock, no bigger than my fist, with something carved into it. It was just a few crude lines, but the shape was unmistakable. A figure, crouched low to the ground, almost animalistic. My skin crawled. I picked it up, but as I held it, I realized the sun was starting to set. We had been here for hours, but it didn't feel like it. The day had slipped by too quickly, and now the forest was darker than before, like it was swallowing the light. Without a word, we finished packing and got into the car. The drive back was silent. None of us spoke about what happened, and none of us wanted to acknowledge it. But as I glanced into the rearview mirror, I saw something in the woods. A shadow watching us, standing just out of sight, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw those same crude lines carved into a tree in the distance. I didn't say anything to the others, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never go back to that place again. There was something out there, something not quite human, and I don't think it was ever meant for us to find it. As we drove farther away, the woods finally faded from view, but the unease, the feeling of being watched, never left me. It stayed with me long after we left, and I knew it would follow me for a long time. What happened out there, I still don't know, but whatever it was, it's better left alone. I never thought a simple weekend camping trip could turn into something that would stick with me for the rest of my life. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. My friends and I had planned it down to the last detail. It was supposed to be nothing more than a break from the stress of our daily lives, a chance to disconnect from everything: phones, work, the chaos of city living, and just enjoy the outdoors. A few nights in a quiet, secluded forest, with nothing but the sound of trees swaying and animals in the distance. What could go wrong? We arrived at the campsite early in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. The area we chose was far from any main roads, tucked away in a part of the national forest that didn't get much traffic. This was by design. Away from the crowds, we thought we'd have more peace and privacy. After parking and unloading the car, we set to work. My friends, ever the experienced campers, had no problem setting up the tents. I, on the other hand, was a bit more clueless. But I didn't mind, I was just happy to be there. It didn't take long for the campfire to be set up. As the sun dipped lower, the air grew cooler, and the light began to fade, casting the entire area in a soft, golden glow. The fire crackled to life, its warm light dancing in the shadows of the trees. I sat back on a log, watching as the flames flickered. The smell of pine and damp earth filled the air, mixing with the scent of roasting marshmallows. We joked, laughed, and relaxed, unaware of the unease that was beginning to settle in my stomach. It started with the sounds. I didn't think much of it at first, the creaking of the trees, the occasional rustle in the bushes. It was natural, right? Wildlife. But the longer we sat there, the more I felt like we weren't alone, like something was watching us. The wind picked up, sending shivers through the trees, but it wasn't the wind that bothered me. It was the silence that came after. It was too quiet. The crickets stopped chirping, and the usual sounds of the forest seemed to vanish. For a moment, all I could hear was the crackling of the fire and the beating of my own heart. I shook it off, trying to convince myself it was nothing. My friends were too caught up in their own conversation to notice my discomfort. But I couldn't ignore the feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. When darkness finally settled in, we all retreated to our tents. The cold air seemed to press in closer as the night stretched on, and I found it hard to fall asleep. My sleeping bag felt more like a tomb than a cozy retreat. I kept hearing sounds outside, footsteps, twigs snapping, leaves shifting. Every time I pulled my blanket tighter around me, I heard it again. It wasn't the wind. It was something moving, slowly, cautiously. The sound stopped as quickly as it had started. Then I heard a voice, not a whisper, but a faint call, like someone was shouting from a distance. It didn't make any sense. No one else was out there. My friends were all asleep. I held my breath, trying to listen more carefully. Nothing. It was gone. But my heart was pounding. and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't want to disturb anyone, so I tried to brush it off and close my eyes, forcing myself to sleep. It didn't work. I lay awake for what felt like hours, staring at the fabric of the tent ceiling, my mind racing. Every creak of the trees, every rustle in the underbrush, made my skin crawl. Eventually, I drifted off, but my sleep wasn't peaceful. I kept dreaming of figures in the dark, of shadows moving just beyond the edge of the campfire's glow. Something was lurking out there, just waiting for me to make a mistake. The next morning, I woke up groggily, the remnants of the night's unsettling thoughts still lingering. I didn't say anything to my friends, not wanting to sound paranoid. It was probably just my imagination, right? After all, I wasn't used to the wilderness like they were. We spent the day hiking through the forest, enjoying the beauty of the place. The trees towered over us, their branches high above, weaving a canopy that filtered the sunlight into soft beams. Birds chirped and flitted through the branches, and the air was thick with the earthy scent of the forest. But the strange feeling didn't leave me. In fact, it grew stronger. The deeper we went into the forest, the more uneasy I became. It wasn't until we stopped for lunch near a small, secluded creek that I saw it. A set of tracks. At first, I thought nothing of it. Animals, right? But then I noticed the way they were spaced out, the strange pattern. These tracks weren't from any animal I recognized. They were too large, too deep, like something was walking on two legs, but not quite human. I pointed it out to my friends, but they brushed it off. Probably just a bear, one of them said, and the rest agreed. But I wasn't convinced. There was something off about it. Something wrong. That night, we decided to stay up later than usual, hoping to enjoy the stars. The campfire was low, its orange glow casting long shadows against the trees. The air was colder, and the wind had picked up again, rustling the leaves and branches. For a while, everything seemed normal. We sat in silence, just watching the sky, when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up again. There was movement in the trees. Slow, deliberate movement. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it happened again. Something large was moving through the brush, circling us. I couldn't make out what it was, but I felt its presence. My friends were too caught up in their conversation to notice, but I was frozen, staring into the darkness, waiting for whatever it was to show itself. Then, out of nowhere, a loud crash broke the silence. A heavy branch snapped, followed by a low grunt. My heart stopped. Whatever it was, it wasn't trying to hide anymore. It was getting closer. I jumped to my feet, adrenaline flooding my body. "Do you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice shaky. My friends looked around, now realizing the unsettling noises I had been hearing all along. One of them stood up cautiously, walking toward the trees, calling out to whatever it was. "Hello?" he called. "Is someone out there?" There was no response, just more rustling, followed by the distinct sound of something moving in the underbrush. My heart raced, and I grabbed the nearest flashlight, pointing it toward the sound. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and bushes. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Something was watching us. Suddenly, one of my friends shouted. He had seen something large and dark moving in the shadows, just beyond the light's reach. Panic set in. "Get in the tent!" someone shouted. We all scrambled, rushing back to our tents as fast as we could. Inside, I lay on my back, wide-eyed, my mind racing. What was out there? What had we heard? There were no answers, just the sound of our breathing and the wind howling outside. I couldn't sleep, not with that feeling of being hunted, of being watched. The night seemed to drag on forever. I must have finally drifted off, because I woke up the next morning to the sound of my friends packing up the camp, looking frantic. "We're leaving," One of them said simply, his voice tense, "Now." We didn't ask questions. The tracks, the strange noises, the feeling of being watched. It all added up to something that didn't sit right. We packed up the rest of the camp in record time, each of us too afraid to stay another minute. The drive back home was silent. No one spoke much, and I couldn't help but feel that we had narrowly escaped something. As we left the forest behind, the tension slowly started to ease, but the questions lingered. What had been out there? What had been watching us? We didn't know, and I'm not sure I ever want to find out. I never considered myself the type of person who would end up in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by towering trees and endless dark. But there I was, at the edge of Pine Ridge National Park, a place known for its quiet beauty, with my campfire crackling weakly as the sun dipped behind the hills. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a chance to disconnect, to clear my mind. I had heard all the usual warnings: watch out for wildlife, stay close to the trail, but I had no intention of letting fear control me. I set up my tent, unpacked the essentials, and made myself comfortable. The solitude felt good, almost peaceful. The first few hours were exactly as I'd expected. The chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle in the underbrush were soothing. The air was crisp, fresh, and I could smell the pine trees around me. Nothing could ruin it. The only other campers I'd seen that day had been in passing, nothing more than faces in the distance. I didn't mind the isolation, it gave me space to think. As night fell and the fire began to die down, a strange silence began to seep into the woods. The usual night sounds, the hoots of owls, the calls of distant animals, started to fade away. It wasn't just quiet, it was unnatural. The silence felt wrong, like something was missing, and it made my skin crawl. I tried to shake it off, blaming it on the isolation and the shadows playing tricks with my mind. I stoked the fire, adding more wood, but the flames seemed to sputter rather than roar. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders, trying to focus on the warmth, but the air was growing colder. I glanced at my phone, no signal. Typical. It didn't matter. I wasn't expecting anyone to call. I stood up and began to stretch, hoping to ward off the creeping feeling that something was watching me. That's when I heard it, a rustle, not from the usual wildlife, but from something deliberate. I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My first thought was that it might be a bear, or maybe a coyote. It wouldn't be the first time I'd heard strange noises at night, but this was different. It wasn't the usual animal sounds I'd grown accustomed to. The rustling continued, closer now, and it wasn't the shifting of leaves or the crackle of branches. It was deliberate, slow. I squinted into the dark, trying to make out any shape, any movement. There was nothing, just the endless blackness of the trees beyond the reach of my campfire. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and flicked it on, pointing it toward the sound. The beam sliced through the darkness, but there was nothing to see. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Just a deer or a raccoon, anything but something that would make me feel this uneasy. But the rustling didn't stop. Came again, this time from the direction of the trees behind me. The hairs on my neck prickled as I turned around, heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't alone. Panic hit me like a wave. I turned off the flashlight, feeling an overwhelming need to hide, to make myself as small as possible. My mind raced. The woods were quiet again. Too quiet. The fire flickered weakly, casting long shadows that stretched and twisted like something alive. I sat back down by the fire, trying to act normal, to convince myself that everything was fine. Maybe it was a person, just another hiker, but why would they be sneaking around like this? My gut told me something wasn't right. I forced myself to stay calm, but my eyes darted back to the trees every few seconds, trying to spot any movement. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, I couldn't tell. The air grew colder, and I felt my resolve cracking. I reached for the knife I had in my bag, gripping it tightly. It wasn't much, but it made me feel better, like I could at least defend myself if I had to. That's when the fire flared up, throwing harsh shadows across the ground. I jumped, nearly dropping the knife, but my heart skipped a beat when I saw something moving between the trees. A figure, tall but too tall to be a human. It was just a silhouette, blending into the dark like it was part of the woods themselves. I stared, not daring to blink, as the figure slowly moved closer. I could hear the soft crunch of leaves underfoot, like someone walking deliberately, carefully. It wasn't a person, not in any way I recognized. The figure moved with an unnatural fluidity, bending and twisting in ways that didn't make sense. Fear gripped my chest as my mind tried to make sense of it. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, caught between the need to survive and the sheer terror that locked me in place. The figure took another step forward, and I heard the unmistakable sound of breathing. Deep, labored breaths, like something struggling to catch its wind. And then it stopped. For what felt like an eternity, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. The figure stood still, just beyond the edge of the light, watching, waiting. I don't know how long it stood there, but it felt like hours. My heartbeat was so loud in my ears that I couldn't hear anything else. I tried to steady my breath, but every inhale felt shallow, every exhale trembling. I don't know what made me do it, but I stood up, slowly. The figure didn't move. It didn't react. I backed away, keeping my eyes locked on it, and then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, far too many, approaching from behind me. I spun around, my heart slamming in my chest, and that's when I saw them. 3 more figures emerging from the shadows. Each one was as tall as the first, their movements unnervingly smooth, like they weren't human at all. I could see their faces now, pale, almost featureless, with deep shadows where their eyes should be. Their lips were thin, almost non-existent, and they were staring at me with an intensity that felt like it could burn through my skin. My mind went into overdrive. There was no way these could be people, no way they could be anything I'd ever seen before. Panic surged in my veins, and I turned, running without thinking. The darkness swallowed me up immediately. I didn't look back, couldn't. The forest was thick and the ground uneven. My feet stumbled as I sprinted blindly through the trees, the sound of footsteps echoing behind me, but I didn't dare slow down. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. The sound of breathing grew louder, more urgent. Whatever was chasing me wasn't far behind. Then, suddenly, I stumbled upon something unexpected. A trail, the edge of the park. I had no idea how I had gotten there, but I wasn't going to question it. I ran along the path, my legs burning, my chest heaving. My lungs were tight, but I didn't dare stop. The figures had stopped following me, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Every step felt like it was being calculated, like something was still out there, just waiting for me to make one wrong move. I ran until I couldn't run anymore. It wasn't until I collapsed onto the dirt, breathless and trembling, that I realized I was out of the woods. The road. A car passed by, its headlights flashing over me like a beacon. I was safe, at least for the moment. I don't know what happened out there that night. I don't know if I'll ever understand what those figures were or why they were there. But when I finally made it back to civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that Pine Ridge had changed me, that something in the woods was still watching. I've never gone camping again. Not there, not anywhere. Because whatever I saw, it wasn't meant for human eyes. And I don't think it's done with me yet. I didn't expect this trip to be anything out of the ordinary. It was meant to be a peaceful getaway. Just me, some gear, and the quiet of nature. My friends and I had planned this camping trip for weeks, and I was looking forward to a few days of escaping the noise of the city. No phones, no work, just a few nights under the stars. We set out for a remote campsite I had found online. The trail was long and isolated, but that's what I liked about it. No crowds, no distractions, just pure nature. The drive was smooth, the weather perfect, clear skies, a gentle breeze, and the smell of the forest as we got closer. We stopped in a small town to grab supplies before heading into the woods. I remember the shopkeeper at the gas station warning us about the trails. "It's pretty quiet out there. Some folks don't come back after a night," she said with a nervous chuckle. We laughed it off, thinking she was just trying to spook us. We parked at the trailhead, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows on the ground. There was no one else around. It was as if the whole forest was holding its breath. We started hiking, our backpacks heavy with food, water, and the gear we needed. The forest was dense, the trees towering above us, their thick branches blocking out most of the sunlight. The path was narrow with thick underbrush on either side. We moved quietly, the only sounds being our footsteps and the occasional call of a bird or the rustle of leaves. By the time we reached the campsite, the sun had almost disappeared completely. We set up our tents in silence, a sense of unease creeping over me. Something about the place felt off. It wasn't the location, it was beautiful, secluded, but something in the air made my skin itch. It wasn't long before my friends noticed it too, but no one said anything. We tried to shake it off, lighting a fire and cooking our dinner. The fire crackled and popped, casting an orange glow that flickered in the growing darkness. As the night wore on, the forest around us seemed to grow quieter. The wind died down, the birds stopped chirping, and there was a strange stillness in the air. It wasn't the usual peaceful kind of quiet you get in the woods, though. This felt like an unnatural silence, like the forest was holding its breath. It was disconcerting. After a while, we turned in for the night. I crawled into my tent, the cold of the forest creeping in around me. I tried to sleep, but the silence outside made it impossible to relax. Every tiny sound, every snap of a twig, made me jump. The wind hadn't picked up again, but there were rustling noises, like something moving through the brush. My mind kept racing, coming up with all sorts of wild scenarios. I told myself it was just animals, maybe a deer or some raccoons, but I wasn't convinced. It wasn't long before I heard something that made my blood run cold. A faint, distant sound, like the rustle of leaves, but it wasn't the wind. It was a distinct sound, almost deliberate, moving in my direction. I froze, holding my breath, trying to listen more closely. The sound stopped. Then, a few seconds later, I heard it again, closer this time. I stayed perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. The silence between the rustling sounds stretched out like an eternity. I felt a chill run down my spine, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to call out to my friends, but I couldn't make a sound. My mind raced with thoughts of who or what was out there. Then it happened. The sound wasn't from the brush anymore. It was right outside my tent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I heard something. No, someone, scraping their hand against the fabric of my tent. Slowly, carefully, like they were testing it, trying to figure out how to get in. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just lay there, frozen in fear, my thoughts spinning wildly. What was out there? Who was it? Why were they so close? I heard my friends stirring in their tents, but I didn't make a sound. They wouldn't have believed me anyway. They would have thought it was just an animal or my imagination. But it wasn't. Couldn't be. The scraping stopped. And then, in the silence, I heard a low, guttural whisper. so faint that I almost thought I imagined it. But it was clear enough that it sent a wave of terror through me. "Help me?" I blinked, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was weak, desperate, almost broken. It sounded like someone in pain, someone who had been lost for a long time. The whisper came again, this time clearer, as if it was right next to my ear. "Help me?" I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the light. I crawled out of the tent, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and I aimed the beam into the dark woods. Nothing, just trees, shadows, and the faint outline of the distant ridge. The night was still, but the fear clawing at me was real. I stood there for a long time, not knowing what to do. I wanted to call out to my friends, but I didn't want to make a sound. I didn't want to attract whatever it was that had been watching us. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, but nothing happened. The whispers stopped. The rustling noises stopped. It was as if everything had just disappeared. I made my way back to my tent, feeling the cold air closing in around me. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. I stayed up, clutching my flashlight and listening to the silence, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The next morning, my friends were awake, packing up their gear and talking about the night. I didn't mention what had happened. They hadn't heard anything, and I wasn't sure they would believe me. It didn't matter. We were leaving today, and I wanted to forget this place as quickly as I could. We packed up and started down the trail, heading back to the car. The woods felt different in the daylight, less menacing, but still strange. The quiet from last night lingered in the back of my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. As we neared the parking area, I noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints in the mud near the trailhead. They weren't animal tracks, too big, too deep. They looked like boots, and they were fresh. Whoever had made them was close, and they had been watching us. I didn't tell my friends. What was the point? They wouldn't have believed me anyway. We drove back to town, and as we passed the gas station, I couldn't help but glance over at the old woman behind the counter. She was watching us, her eyes following us as we drove by. And for a brief moment, I thought I saw her mouth the words, "I told you so." It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, just me and a couple of friends, a few miles from the nearest town. We set up camp in a secluded part of the forest, somewhere that wasn't on the map, or so we thought. We'd been planning this for months, looking forward to some quiet time around a campfire, telling stories, and maybe catching a glimpse of wildlife. The weather was perfect for camping. Clear skies, cool evenings, warm during the day. We arrived around mid-afternoon, unloading our gear and setting up tents. I couldn't have asked for a better place. The forest felt untouched, the kind of place you dream about when you want to disconnect. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the air smelled fresh, like earth and trees. We all agreed that it was the perfect spot. We set up our camp by a small creek that ran through the area, the sound of running water soothing in the background. After an hour or so, we had everything in place. Our tents were up, the campfire pit was dug, and we were ready to cook our first meal. We decided to hike for a bit before dinner, exploring a trail we found nearby. The path twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the woods. We didn't come across many people, which was exactly what we wanted. There was something peaceful about the isolation. As the sun began to set, we made our way back to camp. The temperature dropped quickly, and the fire felt like a relief when we returned. We roasted some marshmallows and settled in for a quiet night, the kind of peaceful moment you rarely get in a busy world. But that peace didn't last long. It started with a noise, a branch snapping in the distance. At first, I didn't think much of it. Animals, right? But then I heard it again, closer this time. My friend Brian, sitting closest to the edge of the firelight, squinted into the shadows of the trees, as if trying to see something beyond the orange glow of the flames. "It's probably a deer or something," he said, shrugging it off. But there was something about the noise that felt wrong. Not like an animal moving around, but something deliberate, something human. My heart rate kicked up a notch, but I didn't say anything. I wasn't about to look foolish, especially in front of my friends. The wind rustled through the trees, and the noises faded. I tried to focus on the crackling of the fire, telling myself it was just my imagination. But that feeling didn't go away. It lingered. The night wore on, and we finished our snacks and started to get ready for bed. We threw more logs on the fire, and the night seemed to settle again. But as I crawled into my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I tried to convince myself it was just the usual nerves of being in the woods, but deep down, I knew something was off. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps. At first, I thought it might be one of my friends getting up to use the bathroom, but then I remembered no one had left the camp. The footsteps were too soft to be a person, yet too deliberate to be an animal. I lay still, barely breathing, straining my ears in the pitch black. The footsteps continued, circling around the camp, stopping every few seconds as if the person, if it was a person, was listening for something. I didn't move. My heart was pounding in my chest. The sound of the footsteps grew closer, and for the first time that night, I felt the cold, unshakable fear that something was wrong. The footsteps paused just outside my tent. I could hear someone or something breathing slow and shallow. My breath hitched in my throat, but I didn't dare make a sound. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but I couldn't move. The silence stretched on forever. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the footsteps faded away into the night. My mind raced, but my body was frozen, too terrified to react. It wasn't until the sun began to rise that I finally dared to leave the tent. I found Brian and Mark already up, sitting by the campfire, both looking just as shaken as I felt. I didn't need to ask if they'd heard it too. I could see it in their eyes. "I'm not going out there alone today," Brian said, his voice tight. "Not until we figure out what's going on." We all agreed to stick together and pack up. We hadn't planned to leave yet, but after the events of the night, none of us felt safe. We packed our things quickly, but as we were about to break down the tents, something caught my eye: footprints. 3 sets of large, heavy footprints leading right up to our campsite, stopping just at the edge of the fire pit. I crouched down to inspect them, but they didn't look like any animal tracks I'd ever seen. They were too wide, too deep in the soft earth, and they were fresh. Very fresh. I looked up at my friends, and they both stared back at me, pale-faced. We had to get out of there. We left in a hurry, driving back down the narrow, bumpy road toward the nearest town, our minds racing with questions. Who was out there? Why had they been watching us? The silence in the car was deafening, and the only sound was the hum of the engine as we sped away from that godforsaken place. The forest seemed to stretch on forever behind us, but I didn't look back. When we got back to town, we told the ranger at the local office about what had happened, but he just looked at us like we were crazy. "You probably just heard some bears," he said, shrugging. "Happens all the time." But we all knew it wasn't bears. There was something far too human about those footsteps. And as we drove back home that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever, whatever, had been watching us was still out there, waiting. The strange thing is, I never told anyone else the full story. Not because I didn't want to sound crazy, but because I couldn't bring myself to relive it. Every time I think about that night, the footsteps, the breathing, I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't left when we did. What if someone had followed us? Or worse, what if they were still out there, watching, waiting? The only thing I know for sure is that I'll never go camping in that forest again. And if anyone ever asks me about that weekend, I'll tell them it was just a bad trip, nothing more, because there are some things I don't think anyone should know. I've been camping for years. I know how to set up a tent, make a fire, and even how to cook on a camp stove. So, when I decided to go camping alone for a few days in the remote part of the woods near my hometown, I didn't think twice. I was used to the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the chirp of insects, the distant hoot of an owl. Nothing had ever gone wrong, at least not for me. I had chosen a spot far from the usual trails. The woods were quieter there, darker, more secluded. I had an old map my grandfather had given me, detailing all the spots in the area. It was marked with little notations, and one part had a small note, "Quiet place. Go if you want solitude." That was exactly what I was looking for, so I packed my gear and set off. The hike was longer than I expected, but it was worth it. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and the only sounds were the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the occasional bird call overhead. After a few hours, I reached my destination. The place was perfect. A small clearing, surrounded by thick trees. A little stream ran along one side, gurgling softly as it passed over rocks. It was peaceful. I set up camp near the stream. My tent went up smoothly, and I made a fire pit a few feet away. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. I knew I had to start gathering wood before it got too dark. The woods around me were dense, and I didn't want to wander too far once night fell. As the evening deepened, I sat by the fire, the crackling of the wood the only sound. The air was crisp now, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. I had brought enough food for a few days, so I cooked a small meal and sat down to eat. It was quiet, too quiet. There were no birds calling, no insects buzzing, just the fire and the soft rustle of the trees in the wind. Around midnight, I noticed something odd. It was a strange sound, just beyond the reach of the firelight. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, moving through the underbrush, but it didn't sound quite right. It was heavier, like something walking on two legs, but not quite human. I froze, listening. The noise came again, slow, deliberate steps. My heart rate picked up, and I instinctively reached for the knife in my backpack. I stood up slowly, careful not to make any noise, and moved towards the edge of the firelight. The shadows in the trees seemed to shift, but nothing was there. I told myself it was probably a bear or some other large animal, and I shouldn't panic. I went back to my seat, but the unease lingered. I spent the next hour watching the darkness, my eyes scanning the trees for any movement. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself that it was just my imagination, and I settled down to sleep. The night was long and restless. The strange footsteps never returned, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I woke up several times, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter and tried to ignore the feeling in the pit of my stomach that something was wrong. By morning, I was exhausted. The sun had just risen, and the light filtering through the trees was soft and golden. I decided to go for a walk to shake off the lingering anxiety from the night. I grabbed my pack, my knife, and headed deeper into the forest. The woods were still quiet, but in the daylight, everything felt different. The trees looked less intimidating, and the shadows seemed less oppressive. I spent the morning walking, marking down some of the landmarks on my map, and taking in the beauty of the place. By mid-afternoon, I decided it was time to head back to camp. As I approached the clearing, I noticed something strange. The area around my tent looked disturbed. There were footprints in the dirt, large and heavy, as though something had walked around my tent while I was gone. The tracks didn't look like any animal I knew. Too big, too deep. My stomach twisted. I checked the camp carefully, making sure everything was in place. My food supplies had been rifled through. Nothing important was taken, but the fact that someone or something had been there was unsettling. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I kept my knife close, and I kept watch, my eyes scanning the edges of the clearing. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me tense. I don't know what I expected, but nothing happened. The night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next day, I decided I had had enough. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, trying to keep my movements calm and steady. I didn't want to show fear, but the unease had turned into a tangible sense of danger. My thoughts raced as I hiked back down the trail, the weight of the woods pressing in around me. About an hour into the hike back, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Just ahead, in the dirt, was a fresh set of footprints. Large, heavy ones, like the ones I had seen around my camp. But these were different. They weren't just prints in the dirt. They were angled wrong, as though the person, or whatever it was, had been walking at an odd, awkward pace. The tracks didn't go straight down the path. They veered off to the side, deeper into the trees. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to turn back, to ignore it, but I couldn't. I needed to know. Slowly, cautiously, I stepped off the path and followed the trail. The footprints led me deeper into the forest, and I couldn't help but feel that I was being led, drawn in by some invisible force. The trail eventually brought me to a small, overgrown clearing. In the center of it was something I'll never forget. A makeshift shelter, crude and hastily built from branches and tarps. It looked old, as if it had been there for years. It was barely visible among the underbrush, hidden by the trees and the overgrowth. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I wanted to leave, to run, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I was rooted to the spot, staring at the shelter. That's when I heard the sound. It was faint, like a whisper, but it was there. Someone was breathing. I turned around quickly, but there was no one. Just trees. Just the wind. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but eventually, the feeling of being watched became too much. I ran. I ran like I've never run before, back down the trail, back to the main path. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the woods. The daylight felt like a shield around me, and I finally allowed myself to breathe. By the time I reached my car, my legs were shaking. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could barely think straight. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural or in anything that couldn't be explained, but what I found in those woods, and the feeling that someone or something was following me, was something I couldn't shake. I didn't stay for another second. I drove straight home. It's been a few weeks since that trip, and I still think about it. Every time I walk in the woods or hear an unfamiliar noise, my mind flashes back to that moment. I've never gone camping alone again, and I'm not sure I ever will. Whatever was out there, whatever followed me, it was real. It was something more than just a wild animal or a person lost in the woods. It was something else, and I don't think it's done with me yet. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth as I made my way into the woods. I'd always loved camping, finding peace in the stillness of the trees, the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. This time, I had decided to go alone, something I had never done before. I figured it would be a chance for some solitude, a break from the noise of everyday life. The weather was perfect for it. Not too hot, not too cold, and the skies were clear with just a few wisps of clouds drifting lazily by. I found a spot that looked promising, a small clearing tucked between a few tall pines. The ground was soft but solid enough for me to pitch my tent without worrying about it sinking into the ground. I set up camp with ease, the motions feeling almost automatic after so many trips over the years. The tent was secure, the campfire ring cleared of debris, and I had enough firewood gathered to last the night. As the evening approached, I sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance in the growing darkness. It felt peaceful, too peaceful, almost the kind of quiet where you could hear your own thoughts a little too clearly. I kept telling myself it was just the usual anxiety of being alone in the woods, but something felt off. Maybe it was the silence, or maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to stretch just a little too far into the trees. I shrugged it off. It was just the dark messing with my mind, I told myself. The woods were always like this at night. But then, just as the last of the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard something. A sound that wasn't the usual rustling of animals or wind moving through the branches. It was a sharp, almost deliberate noise, like a twig snapping underfoot, followed by the faintest rustle in the underbrush. My heart skipped a beat, but I tried to remain calm. There was no reason to panic. Probably just some small animal, a deer or a raccoon, passing through. It wasn't unusual to hear wildlife in the woods at night. But then the noise came again, closer this time. I stiffened, holding my breath, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the light of the fire. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel something in the air, a strange tension that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself to relax. It was just the wilderness, nothing to be afraid of. But then came the worst sound yet, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground, sending a chill straight to my bones. It was too deep, too primal to be any animal I knew of. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands clammy against the cold metal of the fire poker I had grabbed instinctively. I scanned the trees again, eyes wide, but there was nothing. The fire crackled, sending occasional sparks up into the air, but the silence returned. The growl had stopped, and for a moment, I thought maybe it had been my imagination, or perhaps the wind playing tricks. But then, I heard it again, closer this time, and this time it wasn't just a growl. It was a voice or something mimicking a voice, a hoarse whisper, just on the edge of hearing, carried by the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakably a voice. I jumped to my feet, my breath shallow, heart racing in my chest. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to run, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen, caught between fight or flight. It felt like the darkness had somehow deepened, as though the trees themselves were closing in on me. The whisper came again, and this time, I could hear it more clearly. It sounded like someone was whispering my name. I turned toward the sound, eyes darting over every inch of the woods around me, but there was nothing there. Just the wind, the trees, and my own breathing. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind. It's just an animal, I muttered to myself. Just some weird sound, probably a bird or something. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I stoked the fire, tossing a few more logs onto the flames to make them brighter, hoping the light would chase away whatever was out there. The crackling of the wood filled the silence, but it did little to calm my nerves. My eyes were fixed on the dark line of trees beyond the fire, the shadows too deep, too still. I kept expecting to see something move, but nothing did. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though. It was like there was a presence out there, something hiding just out of view. Eventually, I managed to calm myself down enough to sit back down by the fire. The night felt quieter now, but the tension still lingered in the air. I told myself again that I was being paranoid, that nothing was wrong. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the way it sometimes did when I was alone for too long. But then, just as I was about to lay back and close my eyes, I heard a new sound, the unmistakable crunch of leaves underfoot. Soft, deliberate, like someone or something was trying to move quietly through the woods. My breath caught in my throat, and I snapped my head around, trying to see through the darkness. This time, I wasn't imagining it. There was definitely something moving out there, too close for comfort. Panic surged through me. My heart hammered in my chest, and I could feel the blood rushing to my head. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of there as fast as I could. But where would I go? The woods were vast, and my car was miles away. I grabbed my flashlight, flicking it on, the beam cutting through the darkness, but it revealed nothing but the trees, stretching out into the night. The light trembled in my hands as I scanned the area, but there was no movement, no sign of whatever had made the noise. I didn't know how much longer I could stand it. The silence was deafening now, thick and oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. Suddenly, the bushes just outside the camp rustled. I jumped to my feet, shining the light on the spot. The beam swept over the underbrush, but again, there was nothing there. I don't know how long I stood there, holding the flashlight and waiting for something to happen. But the longer I stood, the more I realized that whatever had been lurking out there was no longer making a sound. The rustling had stopped, and the woods had gone unnaturally quiet once again. Finally, I forced myself to sit back down, my eyes still darting around the camp, the light from the fire flickering in the distance. I didn't know what had been out there or why it had been so close, but it was gone now. At least I hoped it was. The rest of the night passed in a strange kind of uneasy calm. I stayed by the fire, too nervous to sleep, too afraid to let my guard down. My eyes kept flicking to the shadows, expecting something to emerge at any moment. But the hours dragged on, and eventually, the sounds of the forest returned to normal. The occasional hoot of an owl, the distant scurrying of animals, nothing out of the ordinary. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I packed up my camp, still feeling on edge. I didn't know what had happened the night before, or what had caused that strange sensation of being watched. But as I drove away from the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had barely escaped something that had been waiting in the dark. I didn't go back to the woods for a long time after that. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, or maybe there was something out there, something I'd stumbled too close to. Either way, I never did figure it out, but I've never forgotten that night, and I never will. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. Just me and a few friends heading out to the woods for a couple of nights, away from the noise and stress of everyday life. I've been camping many times before, so I wasn't expecting anything unusual. In fact, that's the way I liked it. The quiet, the fresh air, the sound of the campfire crackling in the distance. It was all part of the routine. We picked a secluded spot by a creek, not too far from the main trail, but far enough to feel like we were truly away from everything. The campsite was perfect, nestled among tall pines, the creek running gently beside us, its water clear and cold. We set up tents, gathered some wood for a fire, and soon enough we were sitting around it, laughing and telling stories. It was just like every other camping trip. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. It wasn't anything specific, just a feeling that lingered in the air, like the woods themselves were watching us. The temperature dropped quickly after sunset, and the darkness settled in faster than I expected, swallowing up the forest. We had a couple of flashlights, but it still felt like the night was heavier than usual. As the evening stretched on, I started to notice things I hadn't before. The wind was picking up, making the trees creak and groan like they were about to topple over. And the sound of the creek, which had been so peaceful earlier, now seemed different. I couldn't quite place it. The water, normally soft and rhythmic, started to make strange noises, almost like something moving beneath the surface. Still, I tried to push it out of my mind. We ate dinner, made s'mores, and continued talking. But every now and then, I would catch myself looking into the forest, as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. Nothing bad was going to happen. Around midnight, we all started to wind down. The The fire was burning low, and I could feel myself growing sleepy. I crawled into my tent, trying to shake off the unease that had been nagging at me. But sleep didn't come easy. The sounds of the forest felt louder now, more alive, more purposeful. The wind whistled through the trees, and the creek seemed to murmur secrets in the dark. I pulled my sleeping bag up around me, trying to block it all out. I don't know how long I had been lying there, but I woke up suddenly, heart pounding. Something was wrong. The air felt thick and heavy, like the whole forest was holding its breath. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, straining to hear any sign of what had woken me. And then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, just outside my tent. It wasn't the wind or an animal, it was too deliberate. The kind of sound you hear when someone's trying to move quietly but isn't doing a very good job of it. I held my breath, my mind racing. Was it one of my friends? No, they were all asleep. I could hear their soft breathing from the other tents. This was something else. I stayed perfectly still, listening intently. The rustling grew closer, just outside my tent. My heart was hammering in my chest. I wanted to call out, but I couldn't bring myself to make a sound. I wasn't sure if I wanted to know what was out there. The sound stopped. For a long moment, everything was silent, too silent. I could feel my pulse in my ears, and I realized that even the wind had stopped. The night had gone dead still, and then came the scratching. It was slow at first, like claws dragging across the ground. Then it grew louder, closer. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything, but I couldn't move. The scratching continued, circling my tent, growing more frantic. Whatever it wasn't leaving. I finally gathered the courage to peek outside, just a tiny crack in the flap of the tent. I could barely make out the shadow of something moving just beyond the light of the dying campfire. It was tall, hunched over, definitely not a bear. Bears don't move like that. My stomach twisted into knots as I watched the figure pause in front of my tent. The scratching stopped. There was only silence now, but I could feel it. The figure was staring at me. I had no idea how I knew, but I could sense its eyes on me. I quickly pulled my head back into the tent, holding my breath, praying it hadn't heard me. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The figure was still there, just outside my tent, making no sound. I didn't dare look again. The only thing I could hear now was my own heartbeat, loud in my ears. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The scratching, the presence, the weird sense of being watched. All of it disappeared. The wind picked up again, rustling the trees, and the creek resumed its normal gentle flow. It was as if nothing had happened. But I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I stayed awake, my eyes fixed on the entrance of the tent, expecting the thing to come back. I was too terrified to move, too afraid to even make a sound. It wasn't until the first light of dawn broke through the trees that I dared to leave my tent. When I emerged, the campsite looked the same. My friends were still asleep in their tents, unaware of anything unusual. I tried to act normal, but inside, my mind was racing. I didn't want to tell them what had happened. What if they thought I was just imagining things? I kept it to myself, pushing the memory to the back of my mind. I didn't want to spoil the trip. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. We went hiking, swam in the creek, and spent the evening around the fire again. But something had changed. The sense of unease hadn't left me. It lingered in the air, like an invisible weight pressing down on me. The woods felt different, not in a mystical way, not like something out of a ghost story, but in a way that made me feel like I wasn't welcome, like the forest was keeping secrets I wasn't meant to know. As night fell again, I was even more on edge. The fire crackled, the trees swayed in the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was as if the woods were alive, watching us, waiting for something. I couldn't explain it, And then, that night, the scratching came again. This time, it wasn't just outside my tent. It was all around us. I could hear it on the sides of the tents, on the trees, even on the rocks by the fire. The same slow, deliberate scratching, like claws dragging across the earth. It was closer now, too close. I didn't wait this time. I grabbed my flashlight and ran to the other tents, shaking my friends awake. We didn't speak, didn't ask questions. We just packed up our gear as quickly as we could, stumbling in the dark, too terrified to even look behind us. We didn't take time to figure out what was happening. We just knew we had to leave. As we made our way back to the main trail, the scratching followed us, growing fainter with each step we took. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, still following us. We didn't stop until we reached the parking lot, exhausted, terrified, and shaken to the core. We didn't talk much on the way home. No one wanted to admit it, but we all knew what had happened. Something had been out there. Something had been watching us. It's been years now since that trip, but I still can't shake the feeling that the woods are hiding something. I never went back, and I'm not sure I ever will. Maybe some places aren't meant to be explored. Maybe some things are better left undisturbed. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. Just a weekend getaway, a few friends, and the tranquility of the forest. Nothing too crazy, nothing too adventurous. Just some tents, a campfire, and maybe a hike or two. It sounded perfect when I first heard about it. My friends and I had been planning it for months, and after weeks of city life, we were ready to escape into nature. We chose a spot deep in the woods, far from the usual hiking paths, and it was recommended by a guy at the local outdoor gear store. "Great spot for camping," he'd said with a grin. "Not too many people go there, but it's perfect if you like privacy." That should have been the first red flag. I mean, privacy isn't always a good thing when it comes to the outdoors, but none of us thought much about it. The drive up was uneventful. The trees grew thicker as we got closer to the spot, the air grew cooler, and the landscape changed from rolling hills to more rugged terrain. When we finally pulled into the clearing, it was even more remote than I expected. The only sign of civilization was a narrow, dirt road that we'd just driven up. No other cars, no other people, just the trees, the rocks, and the sky. We started setting up camp as the sun hung low in the sky. The light started to soften, casting long shadows over the clearing. The forest seemed to watch us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But it wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a vague sense of discomfort that hung in the back of my mind. We set up our tents, each one more or less a small home for the next 2 days. The fire pit was just a few feet away, and I helped gather some dry wood to get a fire started. As the flames flickered to life, the warmth felt good, but it didn't entirely chase away the chill in the air. We laughed, cracked open some beers, and talked about old times. The sounds of the crackling fire and the distant rustling of leaves our only company. It was peaceful, at least for a while. As night fell, the woods came alive with sounds. The chirp of crickets, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the occasional hoot of an owl. We didn't think much of it. We were deep in nature, after all. These sounds were normal. But the longer we sat around the fire, the more I started to notice how empty the night felt. There were no sounds of far-off cars or other campers. No signs of anything outside this small clearing. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I remember it getting colder as the hours passed. It wasn't just the air. It was like the temperature dropped in my chest, too. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and threw another log on the fire. My friends didn't seem to notice. They were talking about something I couldn't really focus on. I tried to brush off the unease, but it was still there, in the back of my head, like a warning that I couldn't quite understand. Something wasn't right, but I didn't know what it was. Eventually, we all crawled into our tents to get some sleep. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was silent. I lay there for a long time, staring at the fabric of the tent above me, listening to the wind rustle through the trees. I must have finally drifted off, because I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. They weren't the sounds of an animal. Too heavy, too deliberate. Someone was walking around our camp. My heart started to pound. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, straining to hear more. There was the soft crunch of gravel underfoot, the shuffle of boots against dirt, and then a long pause. The air around me felt thick, like the world had stopped for a second. I couldn't see anything through the fabric of the tent. The night was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of the dying embers from the fire. But I felt the presence outside, as if someone, something, was standing just beyond the thin walls of my tent, waiting. I didn't move. I didn't dare. The steps started again, circling around our camp. There was no rhyme or reason to it, no pattern. The footsteps just seemed to wander aimlessly. I tried to keep my breathing slow and steady, but the fear was growing, tightening around my chest. I could feel the sweat starting to bead on my forehead. My fingers twitched at my sides, wanting to grab my phone, my flashlight, anything. But I stayed frozen, too terrified to make a sound. Then, a low voice cut through the silence. Not loud, just barely audible. Help? It was a whisper, almost drowned by the rustling of leaves. But I heard it, clear as day. A voice, male maybe. It didn't sound far away. I held my breath, staring into the dark. My heart was hammering in my chest, and every instinct in my body was telling me to stay quiet, stay still. If I moved, whoever or whatever was out there would know I was awake. But after a few moments, the voice came again. Help! This time, there was a little more urgency to it. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Should I wake my friends? Should I go out there and check? Should I even listen? But what if it was someone in danger? I couldn't ignore that. But just as quickly as it had started, the voice fell silent. The footsteps stopped. There was nothing but the wind. And the longer the silence dragged on, the more I began to question what I had heard. Was it real? Was it just my imagination running wild in the dark? I didn't know. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. And then, just when I thought I might have drifted back to sleep, the sound came again. Not a voice. No, this time it was a knock. Not on my tent, but on the tree right outside. A knock, sharp and deliberate. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. Someone or something was knocking on the tree. My pulse quickened. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I knew I couldn't just lay there any longer. I had to find out what was going on. Slowly, I unzipped my tent, careful not to make a sound. I pushed the flap aside just enough to peek out. The fire was just a faint glow, and the rest of the clearing was blanketed in darkness. My friends' tents were still intact, no sign of movement. I reached for my flashlight, but before I could turn it on, I heard something moving in the bushes behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark. But there was nothing there, just trees. The same trees that had been around me all day. The same trees that now felt too close, too watchful. But in the distance, beyond the trees, I saw a figure. Tall, slender, moving just at the edge of the light's reach. And then it was gone. I stumbled back into the tent, heart racing. I had to wake my friends. We had to leave. This was no longer just some random noise. Something was out there. I called out to them in a harsh whisper, shaking them awake. We needed to pack up. Get in the car. Get out of there. They were groggy, confused. But once they saw the fear in my face, they didn't ask questions. We packed up quickly, quietly, trying not to make a sound. The wind rustled again, the trees groaning under its pressure. And in the distance, there was that knock again. A single, sharp sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. We were done. We needed to leave. No more second guessing. As we drove away, the headlights cutting through the night, I glanced back at the forest. It was still, silent, like nothing had ever happened. But I knew we weren't alone out there. By the time we reached the nearest town and stopped at a gas station, I felt the weight in my chest finally lift. The relief was overwhelming, but the questions lingered. Who was out there? What was that voice? What were those knocks? The attendant didn't look up from his phone as I paid for gas, but I had to ask. Maybe he knew something. "Hey," I said, voice hoarse. "Have you ever heard of anything strange happening up by Green Hollow?" His eyes flicked up for a second, a knowing look crossing his face. Then he shrugged. "People say it's best to stay away from that part of the woods. Lot of weird stuff happens out there." He didn't elaborate, but I didn't need him to. I knew what he meant. We were lucky. I didn't know who or what was out there, but I wasn't willing to find out. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend trip, a time to disconnect, get away from the noise of the world, and breathe in some fresh mountain air. I had planned it for weeks, and now, standing at the edge of the forest with my backpack slung over my shoulder, everything seemed perfect. The sun was dipping behind the distant hills, casting a golden glow over the treeline. The rustling of the wind through the trees was calming, and the air smelled earthy, like pine and wet soil. I had hiked out to a spot that seemed far enough away from civilization for me to enjoy a few days of solitude, but not so far that I'd have to deal with the hassle of a long trek. I set up my tent in the clearing just off the trail, right next to a small creek. The sound of the water trickling over rocks was soothing, and the fire pit I found nearby looked like it had been used recently, which reassured me I wasn't the only one who enjoyed this place. I wasn't exactly an experienced camper, but I had enough knowledge to get by, how to set up a fire, how to filter water, how to keep a safe distance from wildlife. Nothing too complicated. After finishing with the tent, I gathered some firewood, snapped off a few dry branches, and lit a small fire. The flames crackled, sending sparks into the darkening sky, and I sat back, taking in the peacefulness around me. Felt good to be away from everything. I pulled out my book, but the pages stayed closed. There was something about the atmosphere. Maybe it was the way the shadows shifted around the fire, or the fact that I was so far removed from the usual distractions of daily life that made it hard to focus. The first few hours were uneventful. I roasted a couple of marshmallows, enjoyed the peace, and watched the stars slowly emerge in the sky. No other campers had come by, and no animals had made any significant appearances, though I occasionally caught glimpses of movement in the trees. Small critters, probably just raccoons or squirrels. I didn't mind. The isolation felt good. But then, just as the fire was starting to die down, I heard something. It was faint at first, just a crack of a twig somewhere off in the distance. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was just an animal, but then I heard it again, a little louder. It wasn't the sound of a small creature. No, this was something larger, something that moved with more purpose. My heart rate picked up as I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. I stood up slowly, trying not to make any sound. I listened hard, but there was nothing, just the usual background sounds of the night. Maybe it was just my imagination, I told myself. Maybe I was overthinking things. I decided to sit back down, but then the noise came again, this time much closer. It was unmistakable now. Footsteps. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I instinctively grabbed the flashlight next to me. My mind raced. Who else could be out here? I had checked the trail before setting up camp, and there had been no signs of anyone else. No hikers, no campsites, just me. The footsteps stopped. Dead silence. My grip tightened on the flashlight, and I stood, unsure of what to do. Should I call out? Should I go investigate? I didn't know, and the fear I felt paralyzed me. I was far from the nearest town, too far to expect help if things went wrong. Another snap. This time, it was so close I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot. I was suddenly aware of how exposed I was. Sitting alone in the middle of the forest with only a small campfire to shield me. I started to think about what could be out there, my mind running wild with possibilities. A hunter? Someone else camping? Or worse, someone who wasn't supposed to be out here? I swung the flashlight around in a wide arc, its beam illuminating the trees around me. Nothing. I was starting to feel ridiculous. There was no one there. It was probably just an animal, I reasoned. A deer, maybe, or a bear. I had read about encounters in this area, though the chances of a bear being this close to a human camp at this time of night were slim. I decided to go check the perimeter of my camp, just to reassure myself. My heart thudded in my chest as I walked around the tent, scanning the shadows for any movement. I didn't see anything. No footprints, no broken branches, no signs of anything unusual. I felt a little silly, but also a little on edge. Maybe I was just too jumpy. I returned to the fire, which had started to die down, and added more wood to keep it going. As I knelt down to adjust the logs, the sound came again, this time right behind me. My blood ran cold. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I stood frozen for a few seconds, listening hard, trying to catch any hint of movement. The wind was picking up now, making it harder to hear anything, but the forest around me seemed to be holding its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. The unease I felt before was now a full-blown panic. My mind raced with thoughts of what to do. Was I being watched? Was someone really out there? Or was it just the forest playing tricks on me? I stayed by the fire, my back against a tree, eyes darting around the clearing. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to see. Maybe a figure emerging from the darkness, maybe a set of glowing eyes peering at me from the shadows. But there was nothing. Nothing but the rustling of the wind and the occasional snap of a branch. Hours passed. The fire dwindled to embers, and the temperature dropped. I could feel the chill seeping through my jacket, but I didn't dare leave the warmth of the fire. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The whole night felt off, like there was an unseen presence lurking just beyond the light's reach. Around 2 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. The fear and the uncertainty were eating at me. I grabbed my gear, my backpack, my water, my phone, and decided to pack up and leave. It wasn't worth the risk, whatever that risk was. I couldn't explain what was making me feel so uneasy, but I wasn't willing to stay another minute in this silent, tense atmosphere. I grabbed the tent stakes and began pulling the tent up, hands shaking as I worked quickly. As I was folding up the last bit of the tent, I heard a sound again. This time unmistakable. A grunt came from somewhere in the woods, right behind me. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. I didn't dare turn around. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but I knew I wouldn't make it far without a plan. I slowly dropped to my knees, reaching for the small knife I had in my backpack, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound of movement grew louder. Someone was coming closer, pushing through the underbrush. I could hear heavy footsteps now, deliberate and measured. Whoever it was, they were walking toward me. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't let them get too close. I waited for a moment, listening as the figure drew nearer. Then, without warning, I bolted toward the trail. The adrenaline kicked in, and I sprinted through the trees, my feet crunching on the leaves as I ran blindly in the dark. The night air burned my lungs, but I didn't dare stop. I had no idea where I was going, but anywhere was better than staying in that clearing. I didn't hear the footsteps anymore, but I could feel the weight of my fear pressing in. Minutes passed, and I finally came to the trail. My legs were aching, my chest tight, but I didn't stop. I kept running, following the trail as best as I could in the dark. The forest seemed endless, stretching on forever in every direction, but I finally saw the faint glow of headlights through the trees. My heart skipped a beat. It was a car. I didn't think twice. I sprinted toward it, and within moments, I reached the road. A couple was parked in a truck by the side of the road, probably taking a break from their own hike. They looked surprised to see me, but I barely registered their faces as I practically collapsed in front of them. I was panting, sweating, and terrified. I told them I needed help, that something was out there. They didn't ask questions. They just helped me into their truck, and we drove off, leaving the forest behind. As we drove, I looked back at the dark outline of the mountains, feeling a mix of relief and confusion. What had happened back there? Who or what had been following me? The next day, I drove home, and the unease that had haunted me in the woods stayed with me. I didn't tell anyone about it, didn't mention the footsteps or the grunting sounds. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe it was just the dark playing tricks on me. But one thing was for sure, I would never camp there again. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the world around me was beginning to change. The golden light of day was fading, replaced by an eerie twilight that seemed to deepen the further I looked into the forest. The campsite was small, nestled in a clearing surrounded by thick woods. I had come here alone, seeking solitude, tired of the noise and chaos of the city. All I needed was a few days to disconnect, recharge, and just be with my thoughts. I'd done this before, camping alone in remote places. It was something I'd grown used to, but tonight was different. Something felt off, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. I'd set up my tent earlier in the day, taking care to make sure everything was in place. A small fire crackled in front of me, casting shadows that danced on the trees. The flames were warm and comforting, but they couldn't chase away the chill creeping up my spine. A faint breeze rustled the leaves above me, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to shake off the discomfort. I was sitting on a log, roasting a marshmallow, trying to push aside the gnawing feeling that something wasn't quite right. The woods around me felt too quiet, too still. No chirping of crickets, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the entire forest had held its breath, waiting. The light from the fire flickered and shifted, casting strange shadows in every direction. I glanced around, but everything appeared normal. Just trees, the underbrush, the flickering shadows. Yet, the longer I sat there, the more the feeling of being watched crept in. I told myself it was just nerves, just my mind playing tricks on me in the solitude of the woods. But then I heard it, a rustling sound, faint but distinct. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, something harmless. But the rustling was getting closer. I froze, the marshmallow halfway to my mouth. It wasn't the usual shuffle of forest animals. This was deliberate, methodical. The noise stopped suddenly, and for a moment, everything was still again. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced around the firelight once more, but saw nothing. The silence dragged on for what felt like an eternity. And then, just as I was about to convince myself it was nothing, the sound came again. Closer this time. Whoever or whatever was out there, it was moving in my direction. I stood up quickly, grabbing the nearest branch and holding it like a makeshift weapon. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every instinct screamed at me to run. But I stayed still, straining my ears to listen. Then, just as quickly as it started, the rustling stopped. I stood there, frozen, every sense on high alert. The firelight flickered, casting wild shadows that made the forest look even more unnerving. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and loud, but that was it. No other sound. The wind shifted, and a new smell reached my nose. Something sharp, metallic. I sniffed the air, confused. Blood? It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. My stomach churned, but I dismissed it as my imagination. The more I thought about it, though, the more real it became. No animal I knew of had a scent like that. I sat back down slowly, trying to calm my nerves. I stared into the fire, my thoughts racing. Was it just an animal? A hunter? Maybe? I knew I shouldn't be paranoid, but this felt different. I'd spent enough time in the woods to know when things didn't seem right. I tried to tell myself that it was nothing, just the wind playing tricks on me. Or maybe I'd been so used to the noise of the city that the quiet of the woods was starting to mess with my mind. I needed to sleep. I needed to get some rest if I was going to enjoy the rest of my trip. But then the rustling came again, closer this time. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. It wasn't just the noise that unsettled me. It was the feeling that I was being hunted. I stood up again, clutching the branch tightly, scanning the darkness between the trees. The firelight didn't reach far, and everything outside of its glow was swallowed by the night. For all I knew, whatever was out there was already watching me. A branch snapped to my left. I turned, heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there. The forest was still quiet again. I stood motionless, waiting, listening. Then I saw it, a shape moving just beyond the edge of the firelight. It was low to the ground like an animal, except it was too big, too wide. For a moment, I thought I saw something resembling a human shape, but it was distorted, twisted, wrong. It moved slowly, deliberately, and then it was gone. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. My breath was coming in shallow gasps, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I didn't want to move, didn't want to do anything that might provoke whatever that thing was. My mind was racing. What was that? Was I imagining things? No, I had seen it. I had seen something. I stumbled back toward the tent, but my feet felt like they were moving in slow motion. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the edge of the woods. The shape had disappeared, but I wasn't foolish enough to think it was gone. Whatever it was still out there. The rustling came again. Closer this time, louder, almost as if it were circling around me. I didn't wait. My breath came in ragged gasps as I dove into the tent, grabbing my flashlight from the bag. My hands shook as I turned it on, casting a beam of light into the darkness. I zipped the tent shut and pressed my back against the cold canvas, heart thudding in my chest. The rustling stopped. The silence was deafening. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe it was just my nerves. Maybe it was just an animal. But then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A slow, deliberate scratching noise against the side of the tent. It wasn't a branch, it wasn't wind. It was too methodical. I froze, clutching the flashlight in my hands. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it would burst. The scratching came again, and again. Whoever or whatever was out there, it wasn't leaving. It started as an ordinary camping trip. Just me, a backpack, and a tent, heading into the mountains for a weekend of solitude. I had planned it as a simple escape, a break from the noise of everyday life. I love hiking and the feeling of being alone in nature, disconnected from everything. A few friends had warned me about going up there alone, especially with how remote it was, but I brushed it off. I thought they were being overly cautious. After all, I had gone on camping trips before, and nothing bad ever happened. The trail was quiet. The only sounds were the crunch of dry leaves underfoot and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the trail. I didn't feel uneasy. Everything felt peaceful. As I made my way deeper into the forest, I passed a small stream, its water glistening in the dying light. It was beautiful, and for a moment, I just stood there, watching it flow. I took a deep breath, the air crisp and cool. Perfect weather for a night under the stars. I found a spot by the edge of a clearing, a flat area surrounded by thick trees. It was about 1/4 mile off the trail, hidden enough to feel private but not too far to be dangerous. Setting up my tent felt familiar. Unpacking, staking the poles into the ground, arranging my sleeping bag inside. I took my time, making sure everything was just right. Once the camp was set, I took out a small stove and made a simple meal: canned chili and a cup of coffee. I ate in silence, staring into the fire. The flame crackled and popped, the warmth contrasting with the cool evening air. The sky darkened quickly, and the stars began to appear, bright against the inky sky. The forest around me seemed to come alive with nocturnal sounds. The distant call of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the creak of tree branches swaying in the breeze. After dinner, I decided to take a short walk to stretch my legs. I grabbed my flashlight and ventured a little farther into the forest, just far enough to enjoy the quiet. The beam of light danced across the trees, casting eerie shadows that seemed to shift and move with the wind. I felt a strange sense of unease, something I couldn't place. It was the kind of feeling you get when you're in an unfamiliar place, but you can't put your finger on why it feels wrong. I shrugged it off. It was just my imagination, I told myself. I'd been in the woods alone before countless times, and I'd never had a reason to feel afraid. But the more I walked, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest felt too still. The sounds of wildlife had quieted down, and there was an odd silence hanging in the air. My footsteps seemed too loud, the sound of my boots crunching on the forest floor unnaturally sharp. I stopped for a moment, listening. Nothing, not a single sound. I turned back toward the camp, my heart beating a little faster now. The feeling of being watched had crept up on me, and though I tried to tell myself I was being ridiculous, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread. When I finally reached my tent, I locked the zipper and sat on the edge of my sleeping bag, staring at the flickering fire in the distance. I couldn't get comfortable. The night was getting colder, and the wind had picked up, causing the trees to sway and creak in a way that was almost unnerving. I thought about going to sleep, but something told me to stay awake. My mind kept racing, replaying the strange silence of the forest. I kept telling myself it was just a fluke, that I was being paranoid, but the feeling didn't go away. Around midnight, I decided to take another quick walk around the camp, just to reassure myself. The fire was still burning low, and the quiet was almost oppressive. The air felt thick, like something was pressing down on me. I checked the area around my tent, making sure everything was fine, but as I walked deeper into the woods, the sensation of being followed returned. I'd seen no one, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the dark forest. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow moving between the trees, but then I realized there was something out there, just beyond the range of my flashlight. It was tall, too tall to be a deer or a bear. It wasn't human either, but it moved like it was. A dark figure, standing still in the darkness, watching me. My heart hammered in my chest. I blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the figure didn't move. It was just standing there. I froze, my breath shallow, my body tense. I knew I should turn around and go back to my tent, but I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. It was as though some part of me was too terrified to break contact. And then, just like that, it was gone. 1 second, it was standing there, and the next, it had disappeared into the trees without a sound. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I turned and ran back to my tent, my feet stumbling over the uneven ground, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I threw myself inside, zipped up the tent, and lay there, staring into the darkness. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I lay in my sleeping bag, too scared to sleep, too terrified to even close my eyes for more than a second. Every noise in the night sounded louder now. The wind, the cracking of twigs, the rustling of leaves. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had seen was still out there, waiting. I stayed awake the entire night, watching the light of the fire flicker through the trees, listening to the silence, and trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that seemed to be wrapping around me. By morning, I was exhausted, but the strange feeling had faded, replaced by a sense of relief that the night was finally over. I packed up my things quickly, eager to leave. As I walked back down the trail, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few steps, expecting to see the dark figure from the night before lurking in the trees. But there was nothing, just the quiet sound of my boots on the dirt path and the chirping of birds. When I reached my car, I breathed a sigh of relief, feeling safe for the first time in hours. I started the engine, but as I looked out the windshield, something caught my eye. There, just at the edge of the trees, was a dark shape. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. I didn't look back this time. I put the car in gear and drove off as fast as I could. Even as I left the woods behind, the feeling of unease lingered, like something was still out there, just beyond my sight. I didn't stop driving until I was far away from that place, and even then, I still couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't left it behind. The trip was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, but it ended up being a reminder that some things are better left unexplored. The woods may seem peaceful at first, but sometimes there's something in them that you don't want to find. I had always thought of myself as someone who loved nature. The calm of the wilderness, the crisp air, and the sense of peace that came from disconnecting from the chaos of daily life were all things I craved. That's why I decided to go on a solo camping trip in the mountains. It was early September, and the weather was supposed to be perfect for a few days away from everything. I packed my gear carefully, made sure I had all the essentials, and set off in the morning. My destination was a small, remote campsite that I'd read about in a hiking book. It was a place known for its serenity, tucked deep into the woods where few people ever ventured. A place, I thought, where I could really unwind and recharge. The drive was long, and the further I went, the fewer signs of civilization I saw. As I turned off the main road and onto a dirt path, the trees closed in on both sides, their branches thick with leaves, blocking out most of the sunlight. It felt like I was entering another world. The sense of isolation grew with every mile. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sky was beginning to darken, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I hadn't planned to camp that night, but the day had slipped away faster than I anticipated. There was no cell service here, so I couldn't check the time, but my instincts told me it was getting late. I decided to go ahead and set up camp before it got dark. The site I had in mind was near a small creek, its gurgling waters providing a soothing backdrop to the otherwise silent forest. I found a decent spot to pitch my tent, and as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was hard to put my finger on it, but the air felt heavier here. The woods seemed unnervingly still. The trees, despite the breeze, hardly moved. It was like the forest was holding its breath. Once the tent was up, I set up a small campfire and sat down to eat. The evening passed slowly. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a blanket of darkness. The fire crackled, sending occasional sparks into the night air. I tried to relax, focusing on the fire and the peaceful sounds of the creek, but my mind kept wandering. I thought I heard something in the distance, some kind of rustling in the trees. Maybe an animal? I didn't think too much of it. It was just the woods being the woods. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped. I wrapped myself in a blanket, trying to keep warm by the fire. The sounds of the forest had become more pronounced now. The occasional chirp of a night creature, the wind in the trees, and the soft murmur of the creek. Everything was normal, until it wasn't. It started with a small sound, almost imperceptible. A twig snapping. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was too loud to be the wind. It had come from somewhere nearby, behind me, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I turned around quickly, my heart racing, but saw nothing. The forest was still, as if mocking my growing anxiety. For a moment, I convinced myself it was nothing, probably a deer or some other small animal. But then it came again, a distinct crunch of something stepping on the dry underbrush. My muscles tensed, and I stood up from my seat by the fire, walking cautiously toward the source of the noise. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above, and the shadows played tricks on my eyes. I squinted, trying to make out any movement in the darkness, but there was nothing. I waited, listening, but the forest seemed to have fallen back into silence. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but it lingered. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe the wind moving things around. But deep down, something told me I wasn't alone. I went back to the fire and stoked the flames, the heat offering a small comfort. The flickering light danced across the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. It was impossible to tell whether the shadows were from the fire or from something else. Then, just as I was about to sit down again, I heard it, louder this time. A footstep, deliberate and slow, coming from the direction of the creek. I froze, the blood draining from my face. The sound was unmistakable. Someone or something was walking towards me. I grabbed the flashlight from my backpack and turned it on, pointing it toward the noise. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing only trees and the bubbling water of the creek. My mind raced. Was it another camper? Someone else lost in the woods? But who would be out here at this hour? I waited, my heart hammering in my chest. The air around me felt suffocating, and the weight of the silence pressed down on me. But no further sounds came. I was left staring into the darkness, the beam of light shaking in my hands. The night stretched on, each minute feeling like an eternity. I sat by the fire, trying to convince myself that there was nothing to fear, that maybe I had imagined it. But the unease remained. Every crack of a twig, every rustling leaf made me jump. Around midnight, I finally crawled into my tent, hoping that sleep would ease my mind. But sleep didn't come. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest, too restless to relax. The thought of someone or something out there in the dark kept me wide awake. Every sound outside the tent sent my pulse racing. Hours passed, and I felt my eyelids growing heavier. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it again, the unmistakable crunch of a footstep. This time it was closer, too close. It was right outside my tent. My heart skipped a beat. I held my breath, praying it was just an animal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Whoever or whatever was out there, it wasn't in a hurry. I lay perfectly still, trying to control my panic. The sound stopped, and for a moment, everything was quiet. Then, I heard a faint rustling sound, like fabric brushing against the ground. Someone was crouching near my tent. I couldn't move. I didn't dare make a sound. What if they could hear me breathing? What if they knew I was awake? The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I had no idea how much time passed, but it felt like forever. Finally, the sound stopped. The footsteps faded into the distance, and the forest returned to its usual state of eerie quiet. I waited a long time before I finally dared to unzip the tent slightly and peer out. There was nothing, no sign of anyone.
No footprints.
Just the stillness of the night. I didn't know whether I was relieved or more frightened. It felt like the worst kind of trick, the kind that messes with your head. I lay there wide awake, staring at the ceiling of the tent, too afraid to close my eyes. The rest of the night passed without incident. I don't know how I managed to sleep, but when the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The feeling of being watched, the heavy silence, all of it was gone. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking slightly. I didn't want to be here anymore. Whatever had happened last night, I didn't want to find out what it was. I didn't want to risk it happening again. By the time I reached my car, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was off about that place. Maybe it wasn't haunted, maybe it wasn't some elaborate prank, but there was something wrong with the woods. And as much as I loved nature, I knew I didn't want to be a part of it anymore. I drove back to the nearest town, my eyes constantly scanning the rearview mirror. The road, now familiar and not nearly as intimidating, seemed to stretch on forever. I kept my foot heavy on the gas pedal, not wanting to stop until I was far from that place. It was the last time I ever went camping alone. Something about that night, the way it made me feel, stayed with me. And even now, as I sit here, I can't help but wonder if there was something I missed, something I didn't see or understand. Maybe it wasn't meant for me to know, but one thing was certain: some things are better left alone. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend in the woods, just me and my tent. I had been looking forward to getting away from the chaos of everyday life. The buzz of the city had worn me down, and I needed a break, just some time to clear my head. So I packed up my gear, drove out to the edge of the national park, and set up camp in a spot that seemed far enough from the crowds but not too isolated. The sun was setting as I finished setting up, casting long shadows across the trees. I stood there for a moment, just taking it all in, the quiet of nature, the rustling of the leaves in the wind. It was almost too quiet, but I didn't think much of it. I set up my campfire, the crackling warmth a welcome contrast to the chill of the evening air. The fire was a small one, just enough to cook a simple dinner and keep me warm. I roasted some hot dogs and heated up a can of beans, eating alone but content. As the darkness fell deeper, the noises of the woods shifted. At first, it was the typical sounds: the chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But as the night went on, something about the silence between those sounds started to feel off. Like the woods had gone too quiet at times, unnaturally still. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe it was the unfamiliarity of the place. There wasn't a single other camper around. I knew that. I had checked when I arrived. But then I heard it, a rustling noise just beyond the circle of light from my campfire, a twig snapping. I sat still, straining my ears. Nothing. I convinced myself it was probably an animal. Deer, maybe, or a raccoon scavenging nearby. Still, I felt a tightness in my chest, a small sense of unease creeping up my spine. I couldn't sit still any longer. I stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and walked toward the sound, telling myself it was nothing. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, flickering slightly as I moved. But the moment I stepped away from the fire, the woods seemed to swallow the light. Everything felt more closed in, darker than it had moments before. I reached the spot where the rustling had come from, but there was nothing there. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, nothing disturbed. I stood there for a few more moments, scanning the area. The only sound was the wind in the trees, and yet that feeling, That nagging feeling kept gnawing at me. I headed back to the campfire, trying to shake off the anxiety that had taken root in my stomach. I told myself to relax, that I was just getting paranoid. But as I sat back down, the rustling noise came again, closer this time. I froze, holding my breath. The sound was louder, and now I could hear the distinct crunch of something moving through the dry underbrush. I gripped my flashlight tighter, waiting. The seconds felt like minutes. But then, as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. I waited for what felt like an eternity before standing up again, this time more cautiously. I was determined to figure out what it was. The flashlight beam cut through the trees again, but this time it felt more oppressive, the shadows growing thicker with each step I took. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. It was as if the forest itself had suddenly become aware of my presence, as if the quietness had turned from peaceful to ominous. I pushed forward a little farther into the woods. My heart was pounding in my chest now, adrenaline kicking in. I told myself it was just an animal, just a deer or some small creature. Maybe it had been foraging nearby, and the noise was nothing more than that. But the deeper I went, the more I felt like I was being watched. The air felt colder, too, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees in just a matter of minutes. I shone the light into the underbrush, my mind racing. But there was nothing there, just dark trees and leaves. No animals, no signs of movement. I turned to head back to my camp, but then I heard it again. A faint scraping noise, like something dragging along the ground. It was different this time, not the rustling of leaves or the sound of paws on the ground. The sound was slower, deliberate. It made my stomach churn. I froze. My flashlight illuminated the trees, but all I could see was darkness, stretching out into the unknown. The sound stopped. I stood there, unsure of what to do, my breath shallow. It was then that I realized something even stranger. The usual forest sounds, the rustling of leaves, the occasional distant animal call had stopped. All I could hear now was my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears. I turned back toward the direction of my camp, my flashlight flickering, the beam wavering in my trembling hand. My brain was telling me to stay calm, but everything in my body was screaming at me to run. I didn't want to look over my shoulder, but I did anyway, just to see if anything was following me. The darkness behind me felt heavy, pressing in. I had to get back to the fire. I turned and made my way back through the woods, but I didn't dare look back again. The flashlight barely illuminated the path, and I kept stumbling over rocks and uneven ground. Every step felt wrong, like I was being guided back to a place I didn't want to be. Finally, I saw the flicker of the firelight through the trees. Relief washed over me, but just as quickly, doubt crept in. I had left my campfire alone. The light had been steady when I left, but now it was flickering, almost as if the wind was playing tricks on it. When I reached the campfire, the first thing I noticed was that the fire had died down considerably. The flames were weak, the embers glowing faintly. But that wasn't what unsettled me. What unsettled me was the figure standing just outside the ring of light. I stopped in my tracks. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't make out the shape clearly at first. It was just a shadow in the night. But as my eyes adjusted, I could see that it wasn't an animal. It was too tall, too human. I blinked, and the figure was gone. Panic surged through me. My mind raced. Had I imagined it? Was I seeing things in the dark? But there was no time to question. I ran to the fire and grabbed the nearest stick, holding it like a weapon, trying to steady my breath. I stood there for a while, waiting for something to happen, but the woods stayed quiet. The shadows danced around me as the last bits of firelight flickered out, leaving only the faint glow of embers. That's when I realized it. The rustling, the scraping sounds, the sudden silence. It wasn't just one thing. It was something bigger, something more than I could explain. I wasn't alone out here. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed up my camp quickly, not even bothering to make breakfast. As I folded up my tent, I noticed something strange. There were marks in the dirt, scratches that weren't there before. I crouched down, studying them. They looked like drag marks, as if something heavy had been pulled across the ground, right up to where I had set up my tent. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been watching me the night before was still out there, just beyond the trees, waiting. The woods were quiet once again, but the air felt charged, tense. I didn't stay long enough to find out what else might be lurking. As I drove away from the campsite, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing at the edge of the woods, watching me leave. But there was nothing. The road behind me was empty, the trees still and silent. I couldn't explain what had happened out there. The sounds, the figure, the feeling of being watched. It was all so real, but there was no logical explanation for it. All I knew for sure was that I wasn't going camping alone again anytime soon. It was supposed to be a weekend escape, just a simple camping trip to get away from the noise, the constant pull of social media, and the overwhelming chaos of everyday life. My friends had all backed out at the last minute. They said they were too busy, had something else to do, or didn't want to risk being out in the wild with the temperatures dropping. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks, and the thought of canceling made me more anxious than it probably should have. So I decided to go alone. I packed my gear the night before: tent, sleeping bag, food, flashlight, a few personal items. Nothing extravagant. The kind of gear a person takes when they plan to go for just 1 or 2 nights. I figured I could survive without company, and besides, I liked the idea of being alone with my thoughts for a bit. Maybe I could even try to work out some of the stress that had been building in me lately. The campsite was a few hours' drive from the city, tucked away in a remote area of the forest. I'd read the reviews online, and most people seemed to think it was quiet, peaceful, and scenic. Perfect place to disconnect. When I arrived, it was just past noon, and the sun hung high, casting sharp shadows over the trees. The forest felt still. No rustling of animals, no sounds of distant voices, just an eerie calm. I set up my tent in a secluded spot near a small creek that trickled lazily between the rocks. The sound of running water was soothing, almost meditative. It felt like the kind of place I could breathe easily and clear my mind. After setting up, I took a moment to just stand there, taking in the beauty around me. The towering trees, the soft underbrush, the sunlight filtering through the leaves. It looked like a scene straight out of a postcard. I unpacked my things, set up a small campfire, and decided to spend the rest of the afternoon hiking. The weather was perfect, not too hot, with just enough of a breeze to keep things comfortable. The path through the woods was well worn, making the hike easier than I expected. As I walked deeper into the forest, I started to notice something strange. It was subtle at first, just a sense of unease creeping up on me. The forest didn't feel entirely natural. The air was still, almost too still. No birds singing, no wind rustling the leaves, not even the typical buzzing of insects. It was as if the entire forest had gone silent. I shook off the thought, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid. The isolation was making me hyper-aware of every sound, and my mind was probably just playing tricks on me. So I pushed on. As I continued down the trail, I came across an old, rotting tree stump that seemed to have been there for years. Something about it struck me as odd. Its size, the way it seemed to be placed so deliberately in the middle of the path. I took a closer look, half expecting to find some animal nest or something that would explain the strange feeling that had settled in my gut. Instead, there was nothing, just a decayed stump, untouched by time, almost like it had been placed there for a reason. I turned around, deciding to head back to camp, but the unease only grew stronger. The air felt thicker, and the light seemed to have shifted subtly. It was as if the forest had changed while I wasn't looking. I hurried my steps, my heart pounding in my chest. When I got back to the campsite, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally across the ground. The fire pit I had left was still unlit, and the tent sat where I had left it, seemingly undisturbed. But something was different. The silence was deafening. It felt almost oppressive, as if the very trees were holding their breath. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. I lit the fire, the warmth offering some comfort, but even then, the feeling didn't subside. In fact, it grew stronger. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, when I heard something, a soft sound, like a twig snapping in the distance. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a rabbit. But then the sound came again, closer this time. Then again. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was moving through the trees. I froze. The sound wasn't like the usual wildlife I'd expect to hear in the forest. It wasn't the rustling of a squirrel or the hoot of an owl. It was deliberate, like footsteps, soft but purposeful. I stood up slowly, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. My first instinct was to reach for my phone, but the signal was always spotty in this area, so it wouldn't help. I grabbed a large stick instead, holding it in front of me like some kind of weapon, though I knew it wouldn't do much. The sounds stopped. Absolute silence followed. For a moment, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Some combination of fatigue and the eerie quiet of the forest playing tricks on me. But then, as if to prove me wrong, I heard it again. This time, a low rustling near the edge of the camp, right where the forest met the clearing. I couldn't tell what it was. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. I tried to peer into the darkness, my eyes straining to make out anything, but there was nothing, just the silhouettes of the trees, moving slightly in the breeze. But I knew something was there. I kept my focus on the darkened trees, watching carefully, waiting for any movement. The fire crackled loudly in the silence, but the more I listened, the more it seemed to distort into the background noise. My ears were fixed on that rustling sound, waiting for it to happen again. I waited and waited, just as I began to think that maybe it was nothing after all. I saw it. A figure, a shadow moving quickly through the trees. It was there, just on the edge of my vision, barely enough to confirm what I thought I had seen. It was tall, thin, and moved with an unnatural quickness. My heart skipped a beat, and panic hit me like a tidal wave. The figure disappeared before I could fully process it, blending back into the forest. I took a shaky breath, my grip tightening on the stick. I had no idea what that was, but I had no intention of waiting to find out. I grabbed my bag and ran for my car. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, but the further I ran, the more frantic my breathing became. I could hear twigs snapping behind me, closer now, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Whoever or whatever was following me wasn't just moving. They were pursuing. I finally made it back to the trail that led to the parking area. My legs burned, my chest tight with the effort, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare look behind me. When I reached my car, I fumbled for my keys, my hands trembling so much that it took a moment to get the door open. I jumped inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it immediately. My heart was still racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The sound of footsteps had stopped, but the silence that followed was just as unnerving. I started the car, not looking back toward the trees. I floored the gas pedal, speeding away from that cursed campsite. The entire drive back, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure following me on foot or in some vehicle. But nothing. Just darkness and the occasional passing car. I didn't stop until I was safely back in the city, away from the woods and whatever had been out there. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to. All I knew was that I had been followed, and it wasn't by anyone I could see. I never went back to that forest.